My name is Maya, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful healthcare founder, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Saturday, they invited me to my brother's wedding reception. Between champagne and fine dining, my brother leaned forward on the microphone, smirking. "You know, Maya, you are lucky we even include you. You are just a nurse." I simply sipped my water and smiled. That night, I bought his debt and emailed my lawyer about foreclosing his house. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my stepmother Valerie's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and worked tirelessly to prove my worth. But none of it mattered to my father Desmond and my stepmother Valerie. They were obsessed with country club status and surface-level success. When my half-brother Jamal came along, he was immediately crowned the golden child. He got a brand new luxury car at 16, while I rode the city bus to my nursing clinicals. My stepmother Valerie would often look at my medical scrubs and tell her wealthy socialite friends that it was a tragedy I lacked the ambition to be a real doctor. They constantly used phrases like, "Respect your elders and family protects family," to manipulate me into shrinking myself so Jamal could shine. The breaking point happened exactly 4 days ago. The setting was the grand ballroom of the most exclusive hotel in downtown Atlanta. It was a 300-guest spectacle designed to show off Jamal and his new bride, Chloe Sterling. Chloe was intelligent, sharp, and born into an affluent old money family. Her father, Richard Sterling, was a heavyweight venture capitalist who funded medical tech startups. He was a man who valued substance over flashy aesthetics, which made him the exact opposite of my father and brother. The ballroom was dripping in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over towering floral arrangements of white orchids and gold-accented greenery. There were custom ice sculptures showcasing the crest of Jamal's fraternity. The guests were a who is who of local politicians, elite business owners, and prominent community leaders. The air smelled of roasted garlic, expensive perfumes, and burning wax from hundreds of candles. Guests wore custom-tailored suits and silk gowns, their jewelry catching the light as they mingled. The catering staff moved like shadows, pouring top-shelf liquor into crystal flutes. My family made sure I knew exactly where I stood in their social hierarchy. While Desmond, Valerie, and Jamal occupied the massive head table covered in silk and fine china, I was seated at table 42. Table 42 was shoved into the darkest corner of the ballroom, right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed past with a tray of food, the heavy wooden doors would hit the back of my chair. I was seated with distant cousins and a few plus ones who looked just as confused to be there as I was. I wore a simple, elegant emerald green dress that I had purchased myself, while Valerie paraded around in a custom designer gown that cost more than a down payment on a house. About 2 hours into the reception, after the 5-course dinner had been served, the clinking of glasses began. It was time for the toasts. Jamal grabbed the microphone from the band leader. He looked immaculate in his tailored tuxedo, flashing that arrogant smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. He started pacing the dance floor, soaking up the attention of the 300 wealthy guests. He gave a pompous speech about building his own financial technology empire, about carrying on the legacy of Black excellence, and about how he and Chloe were going to take over the corporate world. The crowd clapped and cheered. My father Desmond stood up and raised his glass, puffing out his chest with unearned pride. Then Jamal's eyes scanned the room and locked onto my table in the dark corner. His smile turned into a cruel smirk. He gripped the microphone tightly and walked slowly toward the kitchen doors, drawing the entire room's attention directly to me. And of course, I have to give a special shout out to my half-sister Maya Jamal, announced over the sound system, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. The spotlight swung over to hit my face. I squinted against the glaring light. Jamal stopped a few feet from my table. She is just a nurse, folks, still wiping down beds and emptying bedpans, while the rest of us are out here building empires and closing massive deals. He let out a loud, mocking laugh. But do not worry about the bill tonight, Maya. Go ahead and eat up. I know that lobster tail on your plate costs more than your entire weekly shift pay. I could feel the pitying stares of my table mates burning into the side of my face. Years ago, this exact scenario would have sent me spiraling into a panic attack. I would have believed his cruel words. I would have internalized my father's laughter as proof of my own worthlessness. But the woman sitting at table 42 tonight was not the frightened girl they remembered. I had spent the last decade building armor out of pure resilience. My success was not handed to me on a silver platter. It was forged in the fire of 12-hour hospital shifts and sleepless nights coding my healthcare platform. The cruelty of his words hung heavily in the air. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, but from the head table, my father Desmond erupted into loud, hysterical laughter. He slapped his hand on the table, finding the humiliation of his own daughter absolutely hilarious. Valerie sat next to him, sipping her champagne. She leaned over to the woman next to her, but her voice carried perfectly through the quiet room. "It is a shame she wore that cheap dress," Valerie sneered loudly. "She is an absolute embarrassment to the family name." Every eye in the ballroom was fixed on me. They expected me to cry. They expected me to shrink down in my chair, cover my face, and run out through the kitchen doors in tears. That was the reaction Jamal wanted. That was the reaction my family had trained me to have for my entire life. But I did not cry. I did not break down. My heart beat steadily in my chest. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and set it down neatly next to my plate. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Then I stood up. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald dress, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I looked Jamal dead in the eye. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out a solid, heavy, gold-plated business card. I tossed it onto the center of table 42. It landed with a sharp metallic clink that cut through the absolute silence. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, a tall, commanding figure stepped out from the shadows of the crowd. It was Richard Sterling, the billionaire venture capitalist, the man who had paid for exactly half of this lavish $150,000 wedding. He had been walking back from the bar and had stopped right behind Jamal when the insulting toast began. Richard ignored Jamal completely. He stepped past the groom, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the carpet, and walked straight up to my table. He reached down and picked up the heavy gold card I had just dropped. Richard adjusted his suit jacket and stared at the card. Then he slowly took off his reading glasses. His face turned completely pale as he looked from the gold medal in his hand up to my face. The billionaire investor, a man known for his unshakable composure, looked genuinely stunned. "Wait," Richard said, his deep voice carrying without a microphone. "You are Maya Washington," Jamal scoffed, trying to regain control of his moment. "Yeah, Richard, like I said, she is just a nurse at the county hospital. Do not mind her." Richard held up his hand, silencing Jamal instantly. He did not take his eyes off me. "You are the founder and chief executive officer of Melanin Health." Richard stated, his voice growing louder, vibrating with a mix of shock and profound respect. "The woman who completely revolutionized telehealth for underserved communities. The woman who just bought out the East Coast's largest medical supply chain for $40 million in cash yesterday morning." The words echoed off the crystal chandeliers. 40 million, in cash. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The whispering ceased. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. I looked at Richard Sterling and gave him a polite, professional nod. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," I replied evenly. "That is me. And for the record, I still keep my nursing license active." Because unlike some people in this room, I actually know what real hard work looks like. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. The arrogant smirk had completely melted off my brother's face. His jaw hung open. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. At the head table, my father Desmond dropped his glass of bourbon. It shattered against the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Valerie sat frozen, her champagne flute suspended halfway to her mouth, her face drained of all color. Richard Sterling turned to look at Jamal. The billionaire's eyes were like ice. He pulled his own cell phone from his pocket and pressed a button, putting the call on speaker for the entire room to hear. A professional voice answered immediately. "Cancel the wire transfer for the tech startup funding we discussed." Richard commanded his assistant, his voice booming through the silence of the reception hall. "Pull every single dollar out right now. I do not do business with an arrogant little boy who dares to call my biggest strategic partner a bedpan-wiping nurse." The call ended with a sharp click. The finality of that sound echoed in the massive room. Jamal's knees actually buckled, causing him to stumble forward and grab the edge of the nearest table to keep from collapsing onto the polished dance floor. His grand illusion was shattering in real time. My father Desmond tried to stand up, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words to save his golden child, but no sound came out. The sweet taste of justice had finally arrived, and the nightmare was only just beginning. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The jazz band had stopped playing mid-measure, leaving a heavy void that seemed to press down on all 300 guests. Jamal stood frozen under the spotlight, with the microphone still gripped in his sweating hand. He let out a loud, forced laugh that cracked twice before echoing awkwardly across the room. He tried to play it off, waving his free hand dismissively toward Richard Sterling, who was already turning his back. "Mr. Sterling is just confused," Jamal announced, his voice pitching higher than usual. "My sister works at a hospital down the street. She is definitely not buying medical supply chains. Please, everyone enjoy the champagne. The band, can we get some music back on?" Nobody moved. The musicians stared at him blankly. The elite guests, the venture capitalists, the politicians, and the fraternity brothers were already pulling out their phones, typing frantically to verify the bombshell Richard had just dropped. Desmond snapped out of his shock first. My father's face went from pale to a dangerous shade of crimson. He recognized the social suicide unfolding in real time. He moved faster than a man his age should, grabbing my stepmother Valerie by the elbow. They descended upon table 42 like a pair of vultures. Valerie reached me first, her manicured fingers digging viciously into my upper arm. Her acrylic nails pinched my skin through the silk of my emerald dress. "Get up!" she hissed through a rigidly fake smile intended for the watching crowd. "We are going to the bridal suite right now before you ruin this family any further." I did not resist. I could have pulled my arm away and caused a public scene, but I wanted them isolated. I wanted them trapped in a room when the rest of the dominoes fell. Desmond grabbed my other arm, his grip bruising and unforgiving. Together they marched me away from the tables, dragging me through the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen to avoid the main hallway. The kitchen staff flattened themselves against the stainless steel prep counters as my parents hauled me past the steaming ovens and towers of unwashed plates. Jamal sprinted after us, leaving his bewildered guests behind. He shoved past a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers, nearly knocking the man over. Desmond kicked open the heavy oak door of the private bridal suite and threw me inside. I stumbled slightly on the thick plush carpet, but quickly caught my balance. The suite smelled overwhelmingly of strong hairspray, wilted orchids, and spilled champagne. Valerie slammed the door shut behind us, locking it with a sharp metallic click. The heavy soundproofing of the room immediately cut off the ambient noise of the reception outside, leaving us in a tense, suffocating silence. Valerie turned on me, her face contorted with absolute rage. She shoved me hard in the chest, forcing me to step back against a velvet vanity chair. "How much did you pay him to say that?" she screamed, her voice vibrating with venom. "How much of your miserable little paycheck did you promise Richard Sterling to come out there and lie for you? You are always trying to ruin your brother's spotlight, always so desperately jealous." Desmond stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger in my face. "You are sick, Maya. You are mentally unstable. To pull a stunt like this on your brother's wedding day just to get attention. You hired a billionaire to read a script. Do you know how insane you look right now? I calmly brushed my hands down the front of my dress, smoothing the silk where Valerie had shoved me. I looked at their panicked, flushed faces and felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no intimidation, just cold, clinical precision. I did not pay Richard anything, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. He tracks corporate acquisitions for a living. When you buy out a massive medical supply chain for $40 million in cash, the venture capital world takes notice. He simply recognized my face from the industry briefs. Jamal paced the length of the bridal suite, tugging violently at the collar of his custom tuxedo. His polished CEO facade was completely disintegrating. He looked like a cornered animal, sweating profusely and muttering under his breath. "Stop lying!" Valerie screeched, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You are a nurse. You empty bedpans. You do not have $40 million. You are just a vindictive, spiteful girl who could never stand to see Jamal succeed, just like when you selfishly refused to co-sign his student loans 5 years ago. You knew he needed that money to maintain his image at his fraternity, but you hoarded your little savings just to pay for your nursing school. You have always been selfish." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air, action-based gaslighting at its finest. They genuinely believed that my refusal to go into lifelong debt to fund Jamal's lavish college lifestyle was a personal attack. They believed my decision to pay for my own nursing degree by working double shifts at a local diner was an act of supreme selfishness. I looked Valerie dead in the eye, refusing to retreat a single inch. "I am selfish," I asked softly. "That is an interesting perspective, Valerie. But since we are talking about funding lavish lifestyles, let us talk about how this wedding is being paid for." Jamal stopped pacing. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror. "Shut up, Maya," he commanded, his voice trembling. "Do not say another word." Desmond frowned, looking back and forth between Jamal and me. What is she talking about, Jamal? What is she trying to spin now? I did not break eye contact with Valerie. I did not pay Richard Sterling anything, I repeated slowly, emphasizing every single syllable. But someone is paying for this $150,000 wedding on a fraudulent credit line. Valerie scoffed, rolling her eyes and crossing her arms defensively. Jamal's tech company is paying for this wedding. He is the chief executive officer of a highly profitable financial startup. He secured the funding himself. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Jamal's financial startup is a ghost town, Valerie. It is a shell company. He has no product. He has no actual software. He has been running a Ponzi scheme using early investor money to lease luxury cars and buy tailored suits to look the part of a successful entrepreneur. And that shell company went entirely bankrupt 3 months ago. Jamal lunged forward, grabbing the back of a vanity chair. "You shut your mouth, you lying crazy witch!" he yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "You do not know anything about my business." I pulled my phone from my clutch, tapping the screen twice. "I know everything about your business, Jamal. I know that you have been dodging calls from creditors for 16 weeks. I know that this massive reception, the orchids, the ice sculptures, the caviar, it was all charged to a corporate credit card that has been flagged for federal fraud. And I know that you were banking on marrying Chloe today so you could use her family's old money to quietly pay off your debts before the authorities noticed." Desmond's face drained of color. He looked at Jamal, hoping his golden child would immediately laugh off the accusation. But Jamal was hyperventilating, pulling at his bow tie as if it were choking him. "Jamal," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me your company is fine." Jamal could not look our father in the eye. He stared at the carpet, gasping for air. "You see, Dad," I continued, my tone remaining dangerously calm. "Jamal is not a CEO. He is a fraud. He has been stringing you all along, playing the part of the successful elite businessman while drowning in millions of dollars of debt. And Richard Sterling just found out that his future son-in-law is completely broke. That is why Richard canceled the wire transfer." Valerie let out a high-pitched noise of pure denial. "No," she shrieked, covering her ears. No, my son is a success. You are making this up because you are a miserable failure. You forged documents. You hacked something. You are trying to destroy him. She stepped toward me, raising her hand as if she wanted to strike me, but Desmond grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back. Desmond was a man obsessed with appearances, but he was not stupid. He saw the genuine terror radiating from Jamal. He saw the sweat dripping down his son's forehead. "Jamal, fix this!" Desmond barked, his voice vibrating with absolute panic. "Tell me how we fix this right now. We cannot lose the Sterling connection. If this gets out, we will be ruined in this city. Every country club, every board of directors, they will blackball us." Jamal fell to his knees right there on the plush carpet of the bridal suite. He grabbed the fabric of my dress, his fingers digging into my legs. "Maya, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face, ruining his pristine image. "Maya, you have to help me. If you really have that kind of money, you have to bail me out. We are blood. We are family. You have to tell Richard you will guarantee my loans. If you do not, I am going to federal prison." I looked down at the man who had spent his entire life mocking me, stepping on my ambitions and using my parents' favoritism as a weapon to destroy my self-esteem. He was begging for his freedom. "Get your hands off me," I said, my voice as cold as ice. Jamal's panic twisted instantly into violent rage. The rejection snapped the last thread of his sanity. He leaped up from the floor, his face contorted into an ugly snarl. He raised his right hand, pulling it back with every intention of striking me across the face to force my submission. "You will do what I say, you worthless nurse," he roared. Before his hand could descend, the heavy wooden door of the suite's private bathroom swung open with a loud bang. Jamal froze, his hands suspended in midair. Desmond and Valerie whipped their heads around, staring in absolute shock. Standing in the bathroom doorway was Chloe Sterling. She had clearly been in there the entire time. Her breathtaking custom wedding gown was half unzipped, hanging loosely off her shoulders. She held a damp makeup sponge in one hand, having apparently gone in to touch up her face before the speeches. Her posture was rigid. Her eyes, usually so warm and welcoming, were completely devoid of emotion. She looked like a judge about to deliver a death sentence. She stepped out of the bathroom, her gaze sweeping past Desmond, Valerie, and my raised chin, landing squarely on Jamal's raised fist and terrified face. "Who is bankrupt, Jamal?" she asked, her voice slicing through the tension like a razor blade. Chloe stood frozen in the doorway. The heavy mahogany door of the bathroom had swung completely open, revealing her in the harsh fluorescent light of the vanity mirrors. Her breathtaking custom silk gown was unfastened at the back, the delicate lace sleeves slipping down her arms. She clutched a damp makeup sponge in her right hand. Her eyes, usually so warm and welcoming, were completely devoid of emotion. She looked like a judge about to deliver a death sentence. She stepped out of the bathroom, her gaze sweeping past Desmond, brushing past Valerie, and landing squarely on Jamal's raised fist and terrified face. "Who is bankrupt?" "Jamal?" she asked, her voice slicing through the tension like a razor blade. Jamal immediately dropped his hand, stumbling backward as if he had been burned. He let out a high, panicked noise that sounded like a wounded animal. "Chloe, baby," he stammered, his hands fluttering in front of his chest. "It is not what it looks like. We were just having a private family disagreement. You know how stressful weddings can be?" Desmond immediately shifted into damage control mode. He plastered on the charismatic, authoritative smile he used at country club mixers and board meetings. He stepped directly between Chloe and Maya, physically attempting to block the bride's view of me. "Chloe's sweetheart," Desmond said, his voice dropping an octave into a soothing, patronizing tone. "Please go back into the bathroom and finish getting ready. You look absolutely beautiful, by the way. Do not let this little disruption ruin your special day. Maya is just having one of her episodes." Chloe did not move. She crossed her arms over her chest, heedless of the delicate silk of her bodice. "An episode," she repeated flatly. Valerie rushed forward, her heavily beaded gown swishing aggressively. She flanked Desmond, creating a united front of manipulation. "Yes, an episode," Valerie said, adopting a look of profound, fake maternal sorrow. We did not want to burden you with this on your wedding day, Chloe. We know your family values stability. But Maya has severe mental health issues. She has struggled with terrible delusions for years. She has stopped taking her medication, and now she is hallucinating. She is just horribly jealous that Jamal is marrying a woman of your caliber while she is still single and cleaning hospital floors. I stood perfectly still, letting their lies hang in the air. This was their classic playbook: pathologize the victim, discredit the witness. I watched Chloe's eyes narrow as she processed Valerie's words. Desmond stepped closer to Chloe, placing a heavy paternal hand on her bare shoulder. We as a community have to stick together. Chloe Desmond preached, his voice echoing with righteous indignation. The world is hard enough on us. Black women need to uplift our black men, not tear them down with vicious, jealous lies. Jamal is a king. He is building a legacy for you and your future children. You cannot let a bitter, disturbed woman plant seeds of doubt in your marriage. Family protects family. That phrase hit me like a physical blow, dragging up decades of buried resentment. Uplift our black men. Family protects family. Desmond had used those exact phrases when I was 18 years old. I had worked double shifts at a diner for a year to save $3,000 to buy a used car for nursing clinicals. Jamal had found where I hid the cash, stolen every single dollar, and used it to buy designer sneakers and a VIP table at a club to impress his fraternity brothers. When I confronted them, Desmond told me to stop crying. He told me that society was hard on young black men, and Jamal needed to project an image of success to survive. He told me I was being selfish for wanting a car when my brother needed to build his network. He forced me to take the bus for 3 more years while Jamal drove a leased BMW. Chloe stared at Desmond's hand on her shoulder. Then, with deliberate glacial slowness, she reached up and physically removed his hand from her skin. I did not ask for a sermon on community dynamics, Desmond, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. I asked a very simple question. Who is bankrupt? Jamal let out a pathetic whimper. Chloe, please do not listen to her. She is crazy. She just hates that I am a CEO. I decided the conversation had gone on long enough. I did not need to argue with Desmond. I did not need to defend my sanity to Valerie. I had spent my entire life trying to use logic against their manipulation, only to be gaslighted into silence. Today I was letting the data do the talking. I reached into my emerald clutch and pulled out my iPad mini. The bridal suite was equipped with a massive 75-inch flat-screen smart television mounted on the far wall. It was currently displaying a looping slideshow of Jamal and Chloe's engagement photos. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bypassed the security lock, and opened my primary evidence folder. I selected the airdrop icon and targeted the suite's television. A loud, cheerful chime rang out from the television speakers. The romantic engagement photos instantly vanished. The screen went blindingly white, illuminating the dim room with the harsh glare of a legal document. Valerie gasped, taking a step back. Desmond squinted at the massive screen, his jaw dropping. It was a scanned PDF of a legal foreclosure notice. The bold black letters at the top of the page were large enough to be read from across the room. It was addressed to Jamal Washington. The property listed was the luxury penthouse condo in Buckhead that Jamal claimed he had purchased outright with his tech company profits. Chloe stepped around Desmond, walking slowly toward the television. Her eyes scanned the document rapidly. She began reading the details aloud, her voice ringing with disbelief. $8,400 a month in mortgage payments. She read, her voice tight. Missed for 6 consecutive months. Total amount in arrears, $50,400. Final notice of foreclosure and eviction. Jamal let out a choked sob. He grabbed his hair, pacing frantically. It is a mistake, he cried out. The bank made a clerical error. You know how these big banks are, Chloe. They mess up routing numbers all the time. I have my lawyers handling it on Monday. I did not say a word. I simply swiped my finger across the glass screen of my iPad. The image on the television shifted instantly. Another document appeared. This one bore the elegant gold embossed letterhead of the very hotel we were currently standing inside. It was a default notice from the hotel's premier catering and events department. Chloe read the screen, her breathing growing shallow. Total balance for wedding venue catering and services $150,000. Deposit of $75,000 returned due to insufficient funds. Second attempt at deposit retrieval declined by financial institution. Payment demanded in full by 5 p.m. today, or the event will be terminated and security will escort all guests from the premises. Valerie panicked. She rushed toward the television, her hands scrambling along the sleek edges of the mounting bracket, trying to find a power cord to yank out of the wall. "Turn it off!" Valerie screamed, her manicured fingers clawing at the wall. "Turn that ridiculous screen off! Maya, you are hacking the hotel. You forged these. You are a criminal." Chloe turned slowly away from the television. She looked at Jamal. The realization was hitting her in real time. The brilliant, wealthy tech entrepreneur she thought she was marrying was a complete mirage. The luxury condo was a lie. The business was a lie. He did not have a fintech empire. He had nothing but leased cars, maxed-out credit cards, and a desperate plan to marry into her family's wealth before his house of cards collapsed. "You bounced the check for our wedding," Chloe stated, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You told my father you wanted to pay for the reception to prove you could take care of me. You insisted on handling the venue, and you bounced the check. Twice." Jamal cracked. The polished, arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He dropped to his knees right there on the plush hotel carpet. He scrambled across the floor, ruining the sharp crease in his custom tuxedo trousers. He grabbed the hem of Chloe's wedding gown, burying his face in the expensive silk layers. "Chloe, no, please," Jamal sobbed, actual desperate tears streaming down his face and leaving wet marks on her dress. "Please, baby, you have to understand. It is just a temporary cash flow problem. My company is growing so fast, all my capital is tied up in developmental assets. I swear to God I am not broke. I just needed to float the expenses for a few more days." Chloe looked down at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. She yanked her dress out of his grasping hands, taking a large step backward to put physical distance between them. "You are pathetic," she spat. Jamal crawled forward again, his hands clasped together in prayer. "It is true," he begged, his voice cracking hysterically. "My lead investor is finalizing a massive Series B funding round today. The money is absolutely guaranteed. I was not scamming you. I was not stealing from your father. I just needed this weekend to clear. My lead investor believes in me, Chloe. They know I am a genius. Apex Holdings is wiring $10 million to my corporate account this afternoon. I swear to you on my life, we are going to be rich. We are going to be fine." I lowered my iPad, letting it rest at my side. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, the heels of my emerald pumps sinking into the fabric until I was standing directly over my kneeling, sobbing brother. I looked down at his pathetic, tear-streaked face. I thought about the years of mockery. I thought about the jokes at my expense. I thought about him standing in the ballroom 20 minutes ago, laughing as he told 300 people I was just a nurse who wiped beds. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "You mean your primary investor, Apex Holdings?" I asked softly, my voice perfectly conversational. "The venture capital firm that just pulled all their funding 20 minutes ago." Jamal stopped crying instantly. The silence in the room returned thicker and heavier than before. He slowly lifted his head, his tear-shot eyes locking onto mine. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked like a man who had just been told his parachute was filled with silverware. "How do you know that?" Jamal gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you know about Apex Holdings?" I leaned in close, bringing my face down to his level so he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. "Because I'm the majority shareholder of Apex Holdings." Jamal stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the harbor. He tried to formulate a sentence, but his vocal cords completely refused to cooperate. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him with the weight of a freight train. The mighty financial technology chief executive officer, the man who had just spent the last hour mocking me in front of 300 elite guests, was currently kneeling on a hotel carpet in a pool of his own tears. Chloe looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She took another large step backward, wrapping her arms tightly around her chest, as if his sheer proximity was a toxic hazard. She had spent the last 2 years believing she was marrying an equal, a partner who would match her ambition and her family's legacy. Now, looking at the sniveling, desperate man on the floor, she realized she had almost legally bound herself to a master manipulator. Desmond could not handle the sudden and catastrophic shift in power. For 32 years, he had been the undisputed king of our family ecosystem. He dictated the rules, he controlled the finances, and he decided who received praise and who received punishment. Seeing his golden child humiliated and broken on the floor shattered his carefully constructed reality. The suave country club patriarch persona vanished into thin air. His face flushed a deep, angry purple, and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. He marched across the bridal suite, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the plush carpet, and stopped mere inches from my face. He tried to use his physical size to intimidate me, looming over me with a dark, threatening glare. It was a tactic that had worked flawlessly when I was a terrified teenager trying to earn his approval. But I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, the silk of my emerald dress brushing against his trousers. "You listen to me right now!" Desmond roared, his voice vibrating with absolute fury, completely ignoring the presence of the bride standing just a few feet away. "You are going to fix this mess. You are going to take out your phone log into whatever banking accounts you have, and you are going to wire your brother $500,000 immediately. You are going to clear that ridiculous hotel venue debt, you are going to pay off his condominium arrears, and you are going to reinstate his funding through your company." I stared at him, my expression completely neutral, showing absolutely no reaction to his booming voice. I tilted my head slightly to the side. "Am I?" I asked quietly. "Yes, you are," he bellowed, slamming his closed fist down on the nearby glass vanity table. The heavy blow rattled the entire piece of furniture, sending a crystal perfume bottle crashing to the floor where it shattered, sending the sharp scent of jasmine into the air. But Desmond did not even look at the mess he had created. "You are my daughter. Blood is thicker than water. Family protects family. You owe us for raising you. You owe this family for taking care of you after your mother died. We gave you a roof over your head, food on your table, and a name that carries heavy weight in this city. You will not destroy your brother over some petty, vindictive, jealous grudge. You will wire that money right now, Maya, or so help me God, I will make you regret it." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He genuinely believed his own lies. He had repeated the narrative of his benevolence so many times that it had become his absolute truth. He truly thought that providing the bare minimum of survival equated to a lifelong debt of servitude. But I kept the receipts, and I was no longer the frightened girl desperate for her father's affection. "You did not raise me, Desmond." I fired back, my voice slicing through his blind rage with surgical precision. "Do not stand there and act like a generous martyr. You did not provide for me. You exploited me." Desmond opened his mouth to shout again, but I stepped forward, forcing him to take a step back. I was the one backing him into a corner now. "When my mother passed away, she left a substantial life insurance policy, specifically designated for my college education." I continued enunciating every single word, so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding in that room. "It was supposed to be protected in a trust account until I turned 18. Instead, you used a shady legal loophole to liquidate the entire account. You took the money my dying mother meant for my future, and you used it to buy Valerie a brand new Mercedes-Benz." Valerie gasped loudly, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes darting nervously toward Chloe. But I did not let her interrupt my momentum. "Then you sat me down in the living room and told me I needed to learn adult responsibility," I said, keeping my gaze locked intensely on Desmond. "You forced me to get a grueling job at the local diner when I was 16 years old. I worked 30 hours a week after school just to pay for my own groceries, my school supplies, and my bus pass. Meanwhile, Jamal got a highly paid private tutor because his grades were slipping. He got a brand new sports car for his 17th birthday so he would not be embarrassed at school. He got a limitless credit card so he could keep up appearances with his rich friends. You treated me like a live-in maid who financed her own existence, while you treated him like absolute royalty. I owe you nothing. I owe this family nothing." Chloe let out a sharp, audible breath. She was leaning against the bathroom doorframe, her eyes darting between me and Desmond. She was finally seeing the dark, rotting core of the family she had almost married into. She looked at Jamal, still sniveling on the floor, and her disgust deepened. He had happily benefited from my financial and emotional exploitation his entire life without a single ounce of guilt. He had watched me struggle to pay for nursing textbooks while he popped champagne bottles on his father's dime. Seeing that Desmond's aggressive, domineering tactics had spectacularly failed to break me, Valerie decided it was time to tag in. She was a master manipulator capable of shifting her personality in a fraction of a second to suit her desperate needs. The vicious, sneering woman who had mocked my cheap dress in the ballroom vanished completely. In her place stood a fragile, terrified, deeply wounded mother. She practically threw herself across the room, grabbing my hands with her cold, clammy fingers. I tried to pull my arms away, but she held on tight, her long acrylic nails digging uncomfortably into my skin. Genuine tears began to pool in her eyes and spill over her heavily contoured cheeks, leaving dark streaks of expensive mascara down her face. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, playing the role of the desperate matriarch trying to hold her family together. "Maya, please," Valerie sobbed, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured heartbreak. "Please, sweetheart, you have to listen to reason. We can work through all this ugly family history later. We can go to family therapy. We can make amends for the past. But right now, today, we are facing total destruction." She squeezed my hands harder, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp tang of gin and panic on her breath. "If you do not help Jamal, the hotel management is going to call the police, and they are going to walk into that beautiful ballroom and arrest him," she pleaded, her tears flowing freely now. "The entire boule will be out there watching. Our church family is sitting at tables 3 and 4. The deacons, the pastor, the mayor, everyone we know and respect in Atlanta society is waiting out there for a wedding reception. If they find out Jamal is bankrupt, if they see him taken away in handcuffs in front of the catering staff, we will be ruined. We will be kicked out of the country club. We will be social pariahs. Our reputation will be completely destroyed. You cannot do this to us. You are a good person, Maya. You are a healer. Please be the bigger person and save our family reputation." I looked down at Valerie's desperate, tear-stained face. I studied the panic in her eyes. She was not crying for Jamal's well-being. She was not crying for the years of pain they had caused me. She was crying because she was absolutely terrified of losing her VIP seating at charity galas. She was crying because she could not handle the thought of her country club friends gossiping about her over Sunday mimosas. Her entire existence was wrapped up in a fragile illusion of wealth and superiority, and that illusion was currently burning to the ground right in front of her. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my hands, pushing her away. I stepped back, adjusting the cuffs of my dress, refusing to absorb an ounce of her manufactured panic. "It is far too late to worry about the church family, Valerie," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "It is too late to worry about the country club board members, and it is definitely too late to worry about your precious social reputation." Valerie stopped crying abruptly, her eyes widening in sheer confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice dropping to a frightened, hesitant whisper. "What else did you do?" I reached back into my emerald evening clutch. I bypassed my cell phone and pulled out a thick folded legal document printed on heavy stock paper. I kept my eyes locked on her as I unfolded the crisp white pages, the sound of the paper crinkling loudly in the quiet suite. Because I did not just buy Jamal's corporate debt, I explained, walking slowly over to the glass vanity table and smoothing the document flat against the surface. When I started investigating Apex Holdings and following the money trail, I found a tangled web of terrible financial decisions. It turns out Jamal was not the only one living completely beyond his means to impress people who do not actually care about him. I slid the heavy legal document across the glass table. It stopped right in front of Valerie and Desmond, perfectly positioned for them to read the bold black text at the top of the page. I bought the debt on your house, too. The absolute silence that followed my statement was heavy enough to crush bone. Jamal knelt on the floor, staring up at me with eyes so wide they looked perfectly round. The damp streaks of tears on his face caught the harsh light of the vanity bulbs. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. His brain simply refused to process the information. The woman he had spent his entire life degrading, the sister he viewed as nothing more than a convenient punching bag and an unpaid servant, was the phantom investor who had held his entire fraudulent empire in the palm of her hand. I let him drown in this realization. I wanted him to feel the exact moment his carefully constructed illusion of superiority dissolved into absolute nothingness. I had not just refused to co-sign a student loan. I had systematically tracked his shell companies, isolated his primary source of venture capital, and orchestrated a hostile takeover of Apex Holdings, using the millions I had quietly amassed through my own legitimate healthcare software patents. I had become his boss, his creditor, and his executioner without him ever knowing my name. Desmond stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the thick floral wallpaper. His mouth worked silently as he looked from my calm face to the iPad in my hand and then down to his broken son on the carpet. The reality of my wealth and my absolute control over their fate was a mathematical equation his narcissistic mind could not solve. Valerie clutched her chest, her acrylic nails digging into the heavy beating of her gown. She shook her head side to side in rapid, jerky movements, muttering the word no over and over again like a broken metronome. Before Valerie could launch into another desperate string of denials, a deafening crash echoed through the suite. The heavy, solid oak door of the bridal suite did not just open, it was violently kicked inward. The door slammed against the wall with such terrifying force that a framed mirror hanging nearby plummeted to the floor, shattering into jagged shards of glass. Richard Sterling stood in the doorway. The billionaire patriarch of the Sterling family was a man who commanded entire industries with a quiet whisper. He was old money defined by bespoke suits, subtle watches, and an aura of untouchable authority. But right now, Richard was not whispering. He radiated a quiet, terrifying wrath that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. He was flanked by two massive men in dark, tailored suits, whose earpieces and rigid postures clearly marked them as private security. The guards stepped into the room, immediately blocking the exit and securing the perimeter. Richard did not look at me. He did not look at his daughter standing frozen in her ruined wedding dress. He did not even look at Jamal trembling on the floor. His gaze locked onto Desmond with the kind of absolute disgust usually reserved for scraping something foul off the bottom of an expensive shoe. Desmond tried to recover. He plastered on a sickeningly obsequious smile and took a tentative step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Richard, my friend," Desmond stammered, his voice pitching nervously. "There is just a minor misunderstanding happening here. A family squabble that has gotten completely out of hand. We are handling it. Do not ever address me as your friend again." Richard commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that stopped Desmond dead in his tracks. "I just spent the last 20 minutes on the phone with my personal forensic accounting team. I had them pull every single financial record connected to this wedding, to your family, and to that pathetic excuse for a man shivering on the floor." Richard stepped further into the room, his polished leather shoes crunching over the broken glass of the shattered mirror. He pointed a single, impeccably manicured finger directly at Desmond's chest. "Your son did not just lie." Desmond Richard stated each word, striking like a hammer blow. He did not just bounce checks to my country club and default on his luxury penthouse. He crossed a line that I will personally ensure puts him in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. Your son forged my signature to secure the initial bridge loan for this entire wedding. The collective gasp in the room was audible. Chloe covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting to her father in pure shock. Forgery of a billionaire's signature to secure a massive line of credit was not a simple family dispute. It was wire fraud. It was identity theft. It was a guaranteed federal indictment. He used my personal banking details and forged my authorization to guarantee a $200,000 line of credit with a private lender. Richard continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity. He convinced the lender that the Sterling family was quietly backing his tech firm to avoid public disclosure before the marriage. He used my name, my reputation, and my signature to steal money to pay for the caviar he was just eating in my ballroom. Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail. He scrambled backward across the floor away from Richard's terrifying presence until his back hit the side of the velvet sofa. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth like a terrified child. I did not want to do it. Jamal screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. I swear to God, I did not want to do it. The pressure was too much. I was drowning. The creditors were calling my personal cell phone every hour. You committed federal fraud against my family, Richard thundered, stepping toward Jamal. Cornered, terrified, and facing the absolute destruction of his life, Jamal did exactly what a pampered, entitled coward always does. He looked for a human shield. His frantic, bloodshot eyes darted around the room before locking directly onto his mother. Mom told me to do it, Jamal shrieked, pointing a trembling finger directly at Valerie. She made me do it. Valerie froze, her eyes widening in sheer panic. Jamal Washington, you shut your mouth right now, she commanded, her voice shrill and desperate. Do not you dare put your criminal behavior on me. I am not taking the fall for this alone, Jamal sobbed violently, throwing his mother under the bus with zero hesitation. You told me we needed to secure the marriage at all costs. You told me that if I just faked the documents, the Sterlings had so much money they would not even notice a few $100,000 missing until after the wedding was finalized. You said once I was legally married to Chloe, Richard would just quietly pay off my debts to avoid a public scandal. You gave me the idea. You found the lender. You sat next to me at the kitchen table while I practiced tracing his signature from the country club newsletter. The silence that followed Jamal's confession was absolute and horrifying. The sheer calculated malice of the plan hung in the air, exposing the true depth of the Washington family's depravity. They had not just lied about their wealth, they had actively conspired to trap a woman in a fraudulent marriage to extort her family. Desmond slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The polished, charismatic patriarch facade was completely gone, replaced by the pale, sweaty terror of a man watching his entire life evaporate. Desmond was a narcissist who demanded perfection and obedience, but he was also deeply, fiercely protective of his own freedom and social standing. He realized in that agonizing moment that his wife had not just jeopardized their country club membership. She had orchestrated a multi-layered federal fraud conspiracy that could easily send them both to prison as accomplices. You did what Desmond asked, his voice a harsh, strangled whisper. You told him to forge Richard Sterling's signature. Are you completely out of your mind, Valerie? Desmond. I did not. Valerie started stepping toward her husband with her hands outstretched, pleading for his protection. He is lying. The boy is delusional. Maya has poisoned his mind. Do not touch me! Desmond roared violently, slapping her hands away. He backed away from her as if she were carrying a deadly virus. Do not try to play me, Valerie. I know how your mind works. I know what you are capable of when you want to maintain an image. You took this too far. You crossed a line that I cannot protect you from. You have ruined my name. You have destroyed my legacy. Valerie stood utterly alone in the center of the room. Her golden child had betrayed her to save his own skin. Her husband had publicly abandoned her to protect his own freedom. The billionaire they had tried to extort was standing 10 feet away with a security detail ready to call the authorities. She was cornered, and the desperation triggered a wild, manic survival instinct. She spun around facing the room with wild, tear-filled eyes. She immediately adopted a softer, fragile, manipulative tone, forcing fresh crocodile tears to spill over her cheeks. She clasped her hands together against her chest, dropping to her knees on the floor directly in front of Richard and Chloe. "Please," Valerie wept, her voice a masterclass in fabricated agony. "Richard, Chloe, please listen to me. I am a mother. I was just trying to protect my son. I was just trying to help him build a life worthy of your beautiful daughter. We are good people. We are a respectable family. If the Boule finds out about this, we will be destroyed. If our church family hears these lies, we will be ruined in this city. You cannot let this get out. Think of the scandal. Think of the embarrassment to your own family name, Richard. If you call the police, the media will drag the Sterling name through the mud right alongside ours. We can handle this quietly. We can make arrangements. Please, I am begging you on my knees, save our family reputation." I stood perfectly still, watching the magnificent performance. She was still trying to leverage the threat of public scandal against a man who possessed enough wealth to bury her underneath a mountain of litigation. She was still prioritizing the opinions of her church family and her elite social club over the fact that she had committed a felony. I shook my head slowly, the motion catching Valerie's wild, panicked eyes. "It is far too late to worry about the church family, Valerie," I said, my voice slicing through her pathetic sobbing like a scalpel. "It is too late to worry about the country club gossip, because I did not just buy Jamal's corporate debt. I bought the debt on your house too." Valerie stopped crying. She stared at the thick legal document I had slid across the glass vanity table earlier, the deed of trust for their sprawling suburban mansion, the house she paraded around, in the house she used to host lavish garden parties to impress women who secretly despised her. "You are a liar," Valerie spat, her voice instantly losing its fragile tone and dropping into a harsh, guttural snarl. "You are a vindictive, lying little brat. Jamal is lying to save himself, and you are lying because you have always been jealous of us. I never told Jamal to steal anything. I never conspired to take a single dime from the Sterlings. You have no proof. You have absolutely nothing but the psychotic ramblings of a jealous nurse." Chloe stepped forward, her custom silk gown rustling softly against the carpet. The heartbreak and shock that had briefly clouded her eyes were completely gone. She had watched the Washington family turn on each other like starved wolves, and it had hardened her resolve into solid ice. She reached into a hidden pocket of her bridal gown and pulled out her own smartphone. She tapped the screen once, unlocking it and holding it up so the bright screen faced Valerie. "Really, Valerie?" Chloe asked, her voice dripping with lethal aristocratic condescension. "You never conspired to take a single dime. Then why did my wedding planner just forward me a voicemail of you instructing her to charge my father's hidden accounts?" Valerie stared at Chloe's glowing phone screen as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from her heavily made-up face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. "I can explain," Valerie finally stammered, her voice shaking so badly the words barely formed. "Chloe, please, you are taking it out of context. I was just inquiring about backup funding for the floral arrangements." "Do not insult my intelligence," Chloe snapped, her tone glacial. "You explicitly told my planner to access the offshore routing numbers my father uses for his philanthropic trusts. You had Jamal steal those numbers from his desk during our engagement party." Richard Sterling took a menacing step forward, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the thick carpet. "You went into my private study," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. "You used your son's engagement to infiltrate my home and steal my financial data. You are not just a fraud, Valerie. You are a common thief." Desmond watched this exchange with wide, terrified eyes. The walls were rapidly closing in. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of extreme wealth, sophistication, and untouchable elite status. He sat on local charity boards. He golfed with politicians. And now he was standing in a bridal suite moments away from being implicated in a federal wire fraud conspiracy against a billionaire. His survival instinct kicked in raw and ruthless. He turned to his wife, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You crazy woman!" Desmond bellowed, his voice echoing off the soundproofed walls. "You absolutely crazy, psychotic woman! What have you done?" Valerie flinched, reaching a desperate hand out toward him. "Desmond, please, we are in this together. We had to keep up appearances. We had to make sure the wedding happened." "There is no we!" Desmond roared violently, swatting her hand away. "I had absolutely no part in this. I knew nothing about forged signatures. I knew nothing about stolen routing numbers. You orchestrated this entire criminal enterprise behind my back to satisfy your pathetic obsession with high society." Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Desmond Washington, do not you dare act like you are innocent in this. You encouraged Jamal." "I encouraged him to be a successful businessman," Desmond shouted back, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "I did not tell him to commit federal felonies. I am a respected man in this community. I will not let you drag my name into a prison cell. I want a divorce, Valerie. I want a divorce right now. You have completely ruined us." He turned back to Richard, clasping his hands together in a gesture of pathetic subservience. "Richard, I swear to you on my life, I had zero knowledge of this. My wife and my son have lost their minds. They acted entirely alone. I will fully cooperate with your legal team. I will testify against them if I have to. Just please keep my name out of the press." I watched my father grovel. I watched the man who had demanded my absolute obedience for my entire life beg for mercy by throwing his own wife and son to the wolves. It was a pathetic, nauseating display. But I was not going to let him rewrite history and walk away clean. "Do not act holy, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his desperate pleading like a whip. Desmond froze, turning his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were wide with a mix of warning and absolute terror. "Maya, stay out of this. You have done enough damage today." "I am just getting started," I replied smoothly, stepping out from behind the velvet sofa and walking directly into his line of sight. "You are trying to play the innocent victim, the upstanding community leader betrayed by his greedy family. But you knew exactly what Jamal was doing. You knew his company was a complete sham." "That is a lie," Desmond stammered, sweat beginning to bead heavily on his forehead. "I believed in his business." "You believed in his stolen money," I corrected him, tapping the screen of my iPad. "You knew Jamal was stealing from his early investors, and you gladly took your cut to cover up your own pathetic failures. You think nobody knows about your weekend trips to Nevada, Desmond." The blood completely vanished from Desmond's face. He looked as if all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. "Shut up," he hissed, taking a threatening step toward me. One of Richard's private security guards instantly stepped between us, placing a massive hand flat against Desmond's chest and shoving him backward. Desmond stumbled, his expensive watch catching the light as he flailed to keep his balance. "Let her speak!" Richard commanded, his eyes locked on Desmond with renewed disgust. I looked at the television screen, which was still displaying the foreclosure notice on the penthouse. I swiped my finger across my iPad, and the image shifted again. A series of highly classified bank transfer receipts appeared on the massive screen, complete with routing numbers, transaction dates, and highlighted amounts. "You have a severe gambling addiction, Dad," I stated clearly, letting the words ring out for everyone to hear. "You have been bleeding your own savings dry at the blackjack tables in Las Vegas for the last 5 years. When you maxed out your credit lines, you went to loan sharks. And when the loan sharks threatened to break your legs, you went to your golden child." I pointed up at the bright television screen. "These are wire transfers directly from Jamal's fraudulent corporate accounts to the shell companies operated by your bookies in Vegas. 4 transfers in the last 8 months, totaling exactly $250,000. You used Jamal's stolen investor money to pay off your secret gambling debts. You knew exactly where the cash was coming from, and you gladly took it to save your own skin." The suite descended into absolute pandemonium. The carefully curated, polished image of the Washington family imploded in a spectacular display of primal rage and self-preservation. They were cornered rats, and they immediately turned their teeth on each other. "You took my money!" Valerie shrieked, launching herself at Desmond and pounding her fists aggressively against his chest. "You told me we had to remortgage the house to pay for a bad real estate investment. You gambled away our home." Desmond grabbed her wrist, shoving her back so hard she stumbled into a heavy brass floor lamp, sending it crashing to the carpet. "It was his money!" Desmond roared, pointing a shaking finger at Jamal, who was still cowering on the floor. "He owed me! I funded his entire lifestyle. He owed me that money. I was going to federal prison for that money," Jamal screamed, finally scrambling to his feet, his tuxedo jacket torn and his bow tie hanging by a thread. "You bled me dry. Both of you. You demanded I buy you a Mercedes, Mom. You demanded I pay off your bookies, Dad. You used me to fund your fake lives, and now you are letting me take the fall for everything." "You are a grown man," Desmond yelled back, spittle flying from his lips. "You forged the signatures. You committed the fraud. Do not blame us for your absolute incompetence." "I hate both of you," Jamal sobbed, his voice cracking wildly. "You ruined my life. You ruined my wedding." They stood in the center of the luxurious bridal suite, screaming at the top of their lungs, pointing fingers and hurling years of toxic resentment at each other. The elegant country club family, the pillars of their church community, the people who had looked down on my nursing uniform and my tiny apartment were now exposed as nothing more than broke, desperate criminals fighting over the scraps of a stolen fortune. I watched them tear each other apart, feeling a profound, chilling sense of peace. The decades of gaslighting, the constant belittling, the financial manipulation, it all culminated in this exact moment. I had not destroyed them. I had simply turned on the lights and let them destroy themselves. Richard Sterling stood next to his daughter, his arms crossed, watching the violent implosion with grim satisfaction. Chloe had her head held high, refusing to shed a single tear for the pathetic man she had almost married. She looked at me, and for a brief second she gave a slow, respectful nod. She understood exactly what I had done, and she was grateful I had pulled the pin on the grenade before she was legally tied to the blast radius. "Security," Richard said quietly, his voice cutting easily through the shouting of my family. "Call the authorities. Tell them we have a case of major wire fraud and identity theft. I want them escorted out of my hotel in handcuffs." The security guard nodded, reaching for the radio clipped to his lapel. But before the guard could speak, a sharp, frantic knocking echoed against the heavy wood of the suite door. The sound was so urgent, so terrified, that even my screaming family paused, turning their heads toward the entrance. The door was pushed open slowly. The venue manager stepped into the room. He was a small, meticulous man who usually radiated calm professionalism, but right now he was sweating profusely. His clipboard was trembling in his hands and his face was entirely drained of color. He looked past the shattered mirror, past my father's red face, and locked eyes directly with Richard Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," the manager stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "I am terribly sorry to interrupt, but we have a massive security problem downstairs." Richard frowned, his posture stiffening. "What kind of problem?" The manager swallowed hard, his terrified eyes darting briefly toward Jamal. "There is a group of men downstairs. They bypassed our security checkpoint at the loading dock. They are armed, they are extremely aggressive, and they are claiming they are Jamal's other creditors." Jamal let out a faint, terrified whimper, backing away until he hit the vanity counter. "And," the manager whispered, his voice cracking, "they are refusing to leave the main ballroom until they are paid in full." The absolute silence that followed my statement was heavy enough to crush bone. Jamal knelt on the floor, staring up at me with eyes so wide they looked perfectly round. The damp streaks of tears on his face caught the harsh light of the vanity bulbs. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. His brain simply refused to process the information. The woman he had spent his entire life degrading, the sister he viewed as nothing more than a convenient punching bag and an unpaid servant, was the phantom investor who had held his entire fraudulent empire in the palm of her hand. I let him drown in the realization. I wanted him to feel the exact moment his carefully constructed illusion of superiority dissolved into absolute nothingness. I had not just refused to co-sign a student loan. I had systematically tracked his shell companies, isolated his primary source of venture capital, and orchestrated a hostile takeover of Apex Holdings using the millions I had quietly amassed through my own legitimate healthcare software patents. I had become his boss, his creditor, and his executioner, without him ever knowing my name. Desmond stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the thick floral wallpaper. His mouth worked silently as he looked from my calm face to the iPad in my hand and then down to his broken son on the carpet. The reality of my wealth and my absolute control over their fate was a mathematical equation his narcissistic mind could not solve. Valerie clutched her chest, her acrylic nails digging into the heavy beating of her gown. She shook her head side to side in rapid, jerky movements, muttering the word no over and over again like a broken metronome. Before Valerie could launch into another desperate string of denials, a deafening crash echoed through the suite. The heavy, solid oak door of the bridal suite did not just open, it was violently kicked inward. The door slammed against the wall with such terrifying force that a framed mirror hanging nearby plummeted to the floor, shattering into jagged shards of glass. Richard Sterling stood in the doorway. The billionaire patriarch of the Sterling family was a man who commanded entire industries with a quiet whisper. He was old money defined by bespoke suits, subtle watches, and an aura of untouchable authority. But right now, Richard was not whispering. He radiated a quiet, terrifying wrath that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. He was flanked by two massive men in dark tailored suits, whose earpieces and rigid postures clearly marked them as private security. The guards stepped into the room, immediately blocking the exit and securing the perimeter. Richard did not look at me. He did not look at his daughter standing frozen in her ruined wedding dress. He did not even look at Jamal trembling on the floor. His gaze locked onto Desmond with the kind of absolute disgust usually reserved for scraping something foul off the bottom of an expensive shoe. Desmond tried to recover. He plastered on a sickeningly obsequious smile and took a tentative step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Richard, my friend." Desmond stammered, his voice pitching nervously. "There is just a minor misunderstanding happening here. A family squabble that has gotten completely out of hand. We are handling it. Do not ever address me as your friend again." Richard commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that stopped Desmond dead in his tracks. "I just spent the last 20 minutes on the phone with my personal forensic accounting team. I had them pull every single financial record connected to this wedding, to your family, and to that pathetic excuse for a man shivering on the floor." Richard stepped further into the room, his polished leather shoes crunching over the broken glass of the shattered mirror. He pointed a single impeccably manicured finger directly at Desmond's chest. "Your son did not just lie, Desmond." Richard stated each word, striking like a hammer blow. "He did not just bounce checks to my country club and default on his luxury penthouse. He crossed a line that I will personally ensure puts him in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. Your son forged my signature to secure the initial bridge loan for this entire wedding." The collective gasp in the room was audible. Chloe covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting to her father in pure shock. Forgery of a billionaire's signature to secure a massive line of credit was not a simple family dispute. It was wire fraud. It was identity theft. It was a guaranteed federal indictment. He used my personal banking details and forged my authorization to guarantee a $200,000 line of credit with a private lender. Richard continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity. He convinced the lender that the Sterling family was quietly backing his tech firm to avoid public disclosure before the marriage. He used my name, my reputation, and my signature to steal money to pay for the caviar he was just eating in my ballroom. Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail. He scrambled backward across the floor, away from Richard's terrifying presence, until his back hit the side of the velvet sofa. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth like a terrified child. "I did not want to do it," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. "I swear to God I did not want to do it. The pressure was too much. I was drowning. The creditors were calling my personal cell phone every hour. You committed federal fraud against my family, Richard thundered, stepping toward Jamal. Cornered, terrified, and facing the absolute destruction of his life, Jamal did exactly what a pampered, entitled coward always does. He looked for a human shield. His frantic, bloodshot eyes darted around the room before locking directly onto his mother. "Mom told me to do it!" Jamal shrieked, pointing a trembling finger directly at Valerie. "She made me do it!" Valerie froze, her eyes widening in sheer panic. "Jamal Washington, you shut your mouth right now," she commanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Do not you dare put your criminal behavior on me. I am not taking the fall for this alone." Jamal sobbed violently, throwing his mother under the bus with zero hesitation. "You told me we needed to secure the marriage at all costs. You told me that if I just faked the documents, the Sterlings had so much money, they would not even notice a few 100,000 missing until after the wedding was finalized. You said once I was legally married to Chloe, Richard would just quietly pay off my debts to avoid a public scandal. You gave me the idea. You found the lender. You sat next to me at the kitchen table while I practiced tracing his signature from the country club newsletter." The silence that followed Jamal's confession was absolute and horrifying. The sheer calculated malice of the plan hung in the air, exposing the true depth of the Washington family's depravity. They had not just lied about their wealth. They had actively conspired to trap a woman in a fraudulent marriage to extort her family. Desmond slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The polished, charismatic patriarch facade was completely gone, replaced by the pale, sweaty terror of a man watching his entire life evaporate. Desmond was a narcissist who demanded perfection and obedience, but he was also deeply, fiercely protective of his own freedom and social standing. He realized in that agonizing moment that his wife had not just jeopardized their country club membership. She had orchestrated a multi-layered federal fraud conspiracy that could easily send them both to prison as accomplices. "You did what Desmond asked," his voice a harsh, strangled whisper. "You told him to forge Richard Sterling's signature." "Are you completely out of your mind, Valerie?" "Desmond, I did not." Valerie started stepping toward her husband, with her hands outstretched, pleading for his protection. "He is lying. The boy is delusional. Maya has poisoned his mind." "Do not touch me!" Desmond roared violently, slapping her hands away. He backed away from her as if she were carrying a deadly virus. "Do not try to play me, Valerie. I know how your mind works. I know what you are capable of when you want to maintain an image. You took this too far. You crossed a line that I cannot protect you from. You have ruined my name. You have destroyed my legacy." Valerie stood utterly alone in the center of the room. Her golden child had betrayed her to save his own skin. Her husband had publicly abandoned her to protect his own freedom. The billionaire they had tried to extort was standing 10 feet away with a security detail ready to call the authorities. She was cornered, and the desperation triggered a wild, manic survival instinct. She spun around, facing the room with wild, tear-filled eyes. She immediately adopted a softer, fragile, manipulative tone, forcing fresh crocodile tears to spill over her cheeks. She clasped her hands together against her chest, dropping to her knees on the floor directly in front of Richard and Chloe. "Please." Valerie wept, her voice a masterclass in fabricated agony. "Richard, Chloe, please listen to me. I am a mother. I was just trying to protect my son. I was just trying to help him build a life worthy of your beautiful daughter. We are good people. We are a respectable family. If the Boule finds out about this, we will be destroyed. If our church family hears these lies, we will be ruined in this city. You cannot let this get out. Think of the scandal. Think of the embarrassment to your own family name, Richard. If you call the police, the media will drag the Sterling name through the mud right alongside ours. We can handle this quietly. We can make arrangements. Please, I am begging you on my knees, save our family reputation." I stood perfectly still, watching the magnificent performance. She was still trying to leverage the threat of public scandal against a man who possessed enough wealth to bury her underneath a mountain of litigation. She was still prioritizing the opinions of her church family and her elite social club over the fact that she had committed a felony. I shook my head slowly, the motion catching Valerie's wild, panicked eyes. It is far too late to worry about the church family, Valerie, I said, my voice slicing through her pathetic sobbing like a scalpel. It is too late to worry about the country club gossip, because I did not just buy Jamal's corporate debt. I bought the debt on your house too. Valerie stopped crying. She stared at the thick legal document I had slid across the glass vanity table earlier, the deed of trust for their sprawling suburban mansion. The house she paraded around in the house she used to host lavish garden parties to impress women who secretly despised her. You are a liar! Valerie spat, her voice instantly, losing its fragile tone and dropping into a harsh guttural snarl. You are a vindictive, lying little brat. Jamal is lying to save himself, and you are lying because you have always been jealous of us. I never told Jamal to steal anything. I never conspired to take a single dime from the Sterlings. You have no proof. You have absolutely nothing but the psychotic ramblings of a jealous nurse. Chloe stepped forward, her custom silk gown rustling softly against the carpet. The heartbreak and shock that had briefly clouded her eyes were completely gone. She had watched the Washington family turn on each other like starved wolves, and it had hardened her resolve into solid ice. She reached into a hidden pocket of her bridal gown and pulled out her own smartphone. She tapped the screen once, unlocking it, and holding it up so the bright screen faced Valerie. Really, Valerie, Chloe asked, her voice dripping with lethal aristocratic condescension. You never conspired to take a single dime. Then why did my wedding planner just forward me a voicemail of you instructing her to charge my father's hidden accounts? Richard Sterling did not flinch. A man who had survived hostile corporate takeovers and international trade wars was not going to be intimidated by street-level thugs in leased suits crashing his daughter's wedding. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket and looked at the trembling venue manager. Stand down, Richard instructed, his voice radiating absolute authority. My security detail will handle the escort. We are going to the ballroom right now. He turned his cold, calculating gaze back to the Washington family. Desmond was gripping the edge of the vanity, hyperventilating. Valerie was backed against the wallpaper, her hands covering her face. Jamal was still on the floor, looking like a man waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Get them up, Richard snapped to his two massive security guards. We are going for a walk. I want every single one of your elite friends, your church deacons, and your country club board members to see exactly who they have been associating with. You wanted a public spectacle to cement your status. You are going to get one. The guards moved with terrifying efficiency. The first guard hauled Jamal up by the collar of his ruined tuxedo jacket, practically lifting him off his feet. The second guard clamped a massive hand onto Desmond's shoulder, shoving him toward the open doorway. Valerie tried to shrink away, but Richard stepped directly into her path, his eyes blazing with fury. Walk, Valerie, Richard commanded, or I will have you dragged out by your hair for attempting to rob my family. Valerie let out a choked, humiliating sob and stumbled forward, her beaded gown dragging heavily along the carpet. They were marched out of the bridal suite like prisoners of war. Chloe and I hung back, watching the procession file into the hallway. Chloe looked down at her breathtaking custom silk gown, the delicate lace sleeves still slipping down her arms. With calm, deliberate movements, she pulled the sleeves back up and smoothed the heavy fabric of her skirt. She looked at me, her eyes completely dry and devoid of any lingering heartbreak. Shall we? Chloe asked, offering me a polite, icy smile. We shall, I replied. We walked side by side out of the bridal suite, trailing behind the guards and my disgraced family. The walk through the hotel corridors was a surreal, agonizing march. We bypassed the service elevators and took the grand, sweeping marble staircase that descended directly into the main reception foyer. The heavy, muffled sounds of the waiting crowd grew louder with every step. Desmond's legs practically gave out halfway down the stairs, but the security guard shoved him relentlessly forward. Valerie was weeping openly now, her face buried in her hands, desperately trying to hide from the catering staff and hotel employees who stopped to stare. Jamal was stumbling, muttering incoherent pleas to a god he only acknowledged when he needed a favor. I watched their backs, feeling the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon completing a long, complicated operation. They had spent their entire lives obsessed with optics. They had sacrificed my future, stolen my mother's money, and mortgaged their souls to maintain a flawless public image. Now that image was about to be broadcast as a complete, humiliating fraud. The heavy double mahogany doors leading into the main ballroom were closed. Richard stepped ahead of the group, grabbing the polished brass handles. He pushed the doors open with a loud, reverberating crash. The ambient noise of 300 elite guests instantly ceased. The jazz band, which had been softly playing background music to cover the earlier tension, stopped entirely. Every single head in the massive, opulent ballroom snapped toward the entrance. The visual was staggering. The room was dripping in white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and gold-plated table settings. The crème de la crème of Atlanta society sat at their assigned tables wearing custom gowns and tailored tuxedos. And standing in the grand entryway was their beloved patriarch Desmond Washington, sweating disheveled and being physically manhandled by private security. Valerie was sobbing, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her neck. Jamal looked like a terrified hostage. A collective wave of shocked whispers rolled across the ballroom. I saw the head deacon of their church half rise from his seat at table 3, his jaw dropping. I saw the president of Valerie's exclusive social club point a manicured finger, her eyes wide with horrified delight. Richard Sterling marched down the center aisle, forcing Desmond, Valerie, and Jamal to walk ahead of him. The guests parted like the Red Sea, pulling their chairs back, their faces displaying a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. Chloe and I followed silently, our heads held high, refusing to break eye contact with anyone who dared to look our way. We reached the center of the polished mahogany dance floor. And there, standing directly under the largest crystal chandelier, were the uninvited guests. They were not your typical street thugs. They were 3 men dressed in impeccably tailored dark charcoal suits, holding slim leather briefcases. But their posture, the cold, dead look in their eyes, and the aggressive way they occupied the space, screamed danger. They were loan sharks, masking as private creditors, the kind of men who operated in the dark, unregulated corners of the financial world. The kind of men who did not care about country club memberships or church reputations. They only cared about cash. The lead creditor, a tall man with a jagged scar running along his jawline, stepped forward. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at the 300 guests staring in absolute silence. He locked his dead, terrifying eyes directly onto Jamal. Jamal let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak, trying to hide behind his father. But Desmond forcefully shoved him forward, desperate to put space between himself and the dangerous men. "Time is up, kid," the lead creditor said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent ballroom with lethal clarity. "We gave you the extension. We warned you about the consequences. Your little tech company is a ghost town and your accounts are completely drained. We want our $2 million right now." A wave of loud, audible gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. $2 million. The sheer magnitude of the debt echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Women clutched their pearls. Men leaned forward, their eyes widening in shock. Valerie let out a loud, dramatic wail, dropping to the floor in a heap of heavily beaded silk. "We want the $2 million, the creditor repeated, opening his slim leather briefcase with a sharp metallic click. "Or we take the cars, we take the jewelry off your mother's neck, and we take the properties. We have the seizure documents right here, Jamal. We are walking out of this hotel with our money or your assets." Jamal was completely paralyzed with fear. He looked at the fierce, unyielding faces of the creditors. He looked at his father, who was actively backing away, refusing to make eye contact. He looked at his mother, weeping on the floor. Then, in a final spectacular display of delusion, Jamal turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward Richard Sterling. "He is my father-in-law," Jamal screamed, pointing a shaking finger frantically at Richard. "He is a billionaire. He is backing my company. He is paying for this wedding. He will pay the debt. Ask him. He will write you a check right now." The sheer audacity of the demand was almost breathtaking. After forging Richard's signature, after attempting to extort his family, after humiliating his daughter, Jamal still believed he was entitled to a bailout. Richard Sterling did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Jamal with a cold, terrifying emptiness. "I would not pay for your funeral," Richard stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You are nothing to me. You are nothing to this family. You are a fraud, a thief, and a parasite. You belong to them now." Richard turned his back on Jamal, walking over to Chloe and placing a protective arm around her shoulders. He was entirely finished with the Washington family. Jamal dropped to his knees, his hands gripping his hair, letting out a loud, pathetic wail of total defeat. Desmond turned his back, staring at the floor, accepting his complete social and financial destruction. Valerie remained a sobbing heap on the dance floor. The lead creditor watched the pathetic display with mild amusement. He slowly snapped his briefcase shut. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who was simply doing his job. He turned away from the sobbing mess of the Washington family and began scanning the silent, horrified crowd of elite guests. His cold, dead eyes swept across the tables, brushing past the gaping politicians, the terrified church deacons, and the whispering socialites. His gaze continued to sweep the room until he found me standing near the edge of the dance floor, my posture straight, my expression completely serene. The lead creditor stopped moving. He locked eyes with me. He straightened his tailored suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and took a deliberate step in my direction. He stopped 6 feet away from me. He placed his briefcase on the floor. And then, in front of 300 of Atlanta's most elite citizens, in front of my utterly destroyed family, and in front of the billionaire patriarch, the terrifying, ruthless loan shark bowed his head slightly. "Ms. Washington, the creditor," said, his voice echoing loudly in the absolute silence of the ballroom. "We followed your instructions." A collective synchronized gasp ripped through the massive ballroom. The sound was so sharp and sudden, it was as if 300 of Atlanta's most elite citizens had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. The crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to dim under the sheer weight of the revelation. The lead creditor, the terrifying man who had just threatened to strip the Washington family of every asset they possessed, remained perfectly still. His head bowed in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect toward me. Jamal scrambled backward, his leather shoes slipping uselessly against the highly polished mahogany dance floor. He looked from the towering creditor to me, his jaw hanging completely slack. His mind already fracturing under the weight of Richard Sterling's wrath completely short-circuited. He shook his head, his hands pulling at his ruined tuxedo collar as if it were choking him. "Your instructions." Jamal choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. "What instructions?" "Maya, what is he talking about? You are a nurse. You do not have this kind of money. You do not know people like this." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The emerald silk of my evening gown caught the light sweeping across the floor with a soft, authoritative whisper. I did not raise my voice, but in the dead silence of that magnificent room, every single syllable rang out like a judge delivering a final sentence. "You never actually paid attention to what I did." "Jamal," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "You were too busy popping bottles of champagne on yachts you could not afford, and laughing at my cheap clothes. You and Dad assumed that because I wore scrubs and worked in a hospital, I was financially beneath you. But you never bothered to ask what I was actually working on during all those late nights in my tiny apartment." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the terrified faces of my father and stepmother before locking back onto Jamal. "While you were playing the role of a hotshot tech mogul with Daddy's stolen money, I was actually building something real," I explained, enunciating every word for the benefit of the horrified audience watching our family publicly implode. "I developed a proprietary patient triage software algorithm. I patented it, and 2 years ago I sold the licensing rights to a major national healthcare conglomerate. It made me a very wealthy, very quiet woman." Desmond's knees finally buckled. He collapsed into an empty gilded Chiavari chair at the edge of the dance floor, his face buried in his trembling hands. The realization that the daughter he had treated like an embarrassing unpaid servant was actually a self-made millionaire struck him with the force of a freight train. He had spent his entire life worshipping wealth, and he had completely ignored the empire growing right under his own roof. "But I did not just buy your corporate debt out of petty revenge, Jamal," I continued, taking another step closer until I was standing directly over him. When I started looking into Apex Holdings, I expected to find a spoiled brat burning through venture capital. What I found was so much worse. A murmur rippled through the elite crowd. Politicians leaned in closer, socialites pressed their hands to their chests. Richard Sterling stood beside Chloe, his eyes narrowed in cold, calculating fascination. "I found out exactly how you were keeping your fraudulent company afloat," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You were not just scamming rich investors, you were preying on our own community. You set up a secondary shadow lending firm. You targeted innocent Black businesses in Atlanta, small startups, family-owned restaurants, local contractors, and you offered them predatory loans with hidden extortionate interest rates. When they inevitably defaulted, you seized their assets and liquidated their businesses to pay for your luxury penthouse and your designer watches." The ballroom erupted. The shocked whispers turned into loud, audible groans of absolute disgust. The head deacon of our church, a man who had proudly baptized Jamal decades ago, stood up and turned his back to the dance floor in a profound, undeniable gesture of condemnation. Jamal had not just embarrassed his family, he had actively victimized the very community that this room full of elite, successful Black leaders had spent their lives trying to uplift. "When I realized what you were doing to innocent people, I stopped feeling sorry for you," I stated, my eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "I deliberately acquired your debts through a proxy holding company months ago. I bought your commercial loans, I bought your personal lines of credit, and I bought the paper on Mom and Dad's house. I became the ghost creditor you were so terrified of. I let you build this ridiculous, fraudulent house of cards as high as you possibly could, just so I could be the one to kick out the bottom pillar." Jamal let out a guttural, agonizing sob, curling into a tight, pathetic ball on the floor. The illusion was dead. The golden boy was exposed as a predatory, incompetent thief. I turned slowly, my gaze shifting away from my broken brother and locking directly onto Desmond and Valerie. They looked like two hollow, terrified ghosts standing in their expensive evening wear. The social currency they had hoarded their entire lives was evaporating right in front of their eyes, burning up in the harsh spotlight of undeniable truth. "You laughed at me for being a nurse," I said, addressing my father and stepmother. The absolute silence in the ballroom ensured that my voice carried to the very back of the room. "Every time I came to this house, every time I sat at your dinner table, you made sure to remind me of my place. You told your friends I was just a glorified bedpan cleaner. You told Chloe's family that I was an embarrassment to the Washington name." Desmond could not meet my eyes. He stared at his expensive shoes, his shoulders shaking, completely stripped of his arrogant patriarch persona. "You told me over and over again that I was meant to clean up messes," I said, taking a step toward them, forcing them to flinch backward. "You said I lacked the ambition to do anything else. So here I am. I am cleaning up the biggest, most toxic mess in my life. I am cleaning out the rot in this family." Valerie completely shattered. The psychological weight of the moment, the loss of her home, the destruction of her son, and the public execution of her social standing proved to be too much for her fragile, narcissistic mind to handle. Her legs gave out completely. She dropped heavily to her knees right in the center of the dance floor. The heavy hand-beaded silk of her extravagant gown pooled around her on the polished wood like a spilled glass of cheap wine. She threw her hands out, grasping desperately at the hem of my emerald dress, her face a horrific, twisting mask of panic and smeared cosmetics. "Maya, please!" Valerie wailed, her voice echoing with raw, unfiltered terror. "Please, you cannot do this. We are your family. We raised you. Please, I am begging you on my knees in front of God and everyone. If you take the house, we will lose our country club membership. We will be kicked off the charity boards. We will be homeless. You cannot leave us on the street." I looked down at the woman who had made it her absolute mission to make me feel small, insignificant, and unloved for over 2 decades. Even now, facing total annihilation, her mind prioritized her country club membership over the fact that her son was going to prison. She was not crying because she regretted her cruelty. She was crying because she was losing her VIP access. The disgust in the room was palpable. The elite guests the women Valerie had spent years desperately trying to impress looked at her kneeling on the floor with open, unapologetic revulsion. Society is ruthless, and they were already mentally deleting Valerie Washington from their contact lists. I gently but firmly stepped back, pulling the hem of my dress out of her desperate clawing grip. I looked down at her with absolute freezing indifference. There was no anger left in my heart, only the quiet, sterile efficiency of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. "You will not be homeless, Valerie," I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "I hear the local shelter downtown is currently accepting applications. It might do you some good to live in the real world for a while." Valerie let out a sharp, hysterical shriek, covering her face with her trembling hands and collapsing forward onto the hardwood floor. I shifted my gaze past her sobbing form, looking directly at Jamal, who was still hyperventilating against the edge of the velvet sofa. I delivered my final crushing assessment. "But Jamal will not need a house where he is going," I stated coldly. Right on cue, as if the universe itself were orchestrating the final act of this spectacular downfall. The piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens began to echo from the street outside. The sound grew rapidly louder, multiplied by the arrival of several heavy vehicles, until the flashing red and blue lights began to reflect violently against the tall arched windows of the grand ballroom. The authorities had arrived to answer Richard Sterling's call. I offered a single imperceptible nod. The lead creditor understood the silent command immediately. He did not say another word. He simply picked up his leather briefcase, signaled to his two associates, and stepped back into the shadows of the grand ballroom, effectively dissolving into the background. His presence was no longer required. The message had been delivered with surgical precision, and the trap I had spent months building had finally snapped shut. Jamal remained on the floor, his brain completely short-circuiting as the reality of my orchestration settled over him. The sister he had relentlessly mocked, the woman he had dismissed as a lowly hospital worker, was the architect of his total destruction. I had funded his illusion, I had bought his debts, and I had commanded the monsters he feared most. He looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror, realizing too late that he had spent his entire life bullying a predator. The wail of the sirens outside grew deafening, vibrating through the massive glass windows of the hotel ballroom. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls in chaotic strokes, signaling the absolute end of the Washington family's reign. Chloe Sterling did not wait for the authorities to enter. She was a woman raised in a world of cutthroat corporate takeovers and high-stakes power plays. She had watched her fiancé humiliated, exposed and stripped of every lie he had ever told. She had seen the raw, ugly truth of the family she had almost married into. And rather than shrinking away in embarrassment, she took complete control of the narrative. With her head held high, Chloe turned away from the pathetic spectacle of Jamal crying on the floor. She lifted the heavy silk skirt of her breathtaking custom bridal gown and walked with absolute purpose toward the elevated stage where the wedding band had been stationed. The guests parted for her, stepping back to give her a wide berth, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and morbid anticipation. She climbed the short steps to the stage, moving past the silent, wide-eyed musicians, and walked directly to the DJ booth. The sound technician, a young man who looked entirely out of his depth, scrambled backward, handing her the wireless microphone without a single word of protest. Chloe turned to face the room. She stood under the bright stage lights, looking out over the sea of 300 elite guests. She was the picture of aristocratic poise. There were no tears in her eyes. There was no tremor in her hand. She tapped the top of the microphone once. The sharp metallic thump echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the massive ballroom. "Thank you all for coming," Chloe began, her voice steady, crisp, and ringing with absolute composure. The room was so quiet that you could hear the rustle of silk gowns and the sharp intake of breath from the politicians and socialites seated at the front tables. Desmond Washington flinched at the sound of her voice, shrinking deeper into his chair, trying desperately to become invisible. Valerie was still weeping on the hardwood dance floor, a ruined heap of beaded fabric and shattered pride. We gathered here tonight to celebrate what was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful partnership. Chloe continued her gaze sweeping over the crowd before locking directly onto Jamal, who was still kneeling in the center of the room. But I was raised to value honesty, integrity, and transparency above all else. Tonight, it has become abundantly clear that the man I was supposed to marry possesses none of those qualities. She paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of her words. She was not just calling off a wedding, she was issuing a public execution of Jamal's character. Unfortunately, the groom is a fraud, a thief, and a coward, Chloe announced, enunciating each word with lethal precision. He has lied about his wealth, his business, and his character. He attempted to use my family's name to extort money and commit federal fraud. Therefore, there will be no reception. There will be no celebration. The wedding is permanently canceled. A collective, synchronized gasp ripped through the ballroom. The whispers immediately erupted into a chaotic roar. The elite society of Atlanta was absolutely ruthless, and the gossip mill was already churning at warp speed. Phones were being discreetly pulled out under tables. Texts were flying. The Washington family name was officially dead. They would never be invited to another charity gala, another country club dinner, or another high society function again. They were social pariahs, completely exiled from the world they had sacrificed everything to belong to. Before the uproar could fully escalate, the heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were thrown open. A dozen uniformed police officers marched into the room, their heavy boots thudding aggressively against the polished floors. But they were not alone. Trailing closely behind them were 4 men and women wearing sharp, nondescript suits and windbreakers, their badges prominently displayed on lanyards around their necks. Federal agents. Richard Sterling was a man who did not believe in half measures. When he realized Jamal had forged his signature to secure a fraudulent line of credit, he had not just called the local precinct. He had immediately contacted his personal connections at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Wire fraud and identity theft involving interstate lenders and hundreds of thousands of dollars was a federal offense. Richard had promised to bury Jamal, and he was delivering on that promise with terrifying efficiency. The lead detective, a tall man with a stern, weather-beaten face, quickly scanned the chaotic ballroom. Richard Sterling offered a brief, authoritative nod, gesturing silently toward the center of the dance floor. The detective's eyes locked onto Jamal. Jamal watched the federal agents advancing down the center aisle, and his mind finally snapped. The paralyzing fear that had kept him pinned to the floor suddenly mutated into a wild, irrational panic. The reality of a federal penitentiary, of losing his freedom, his luxury cars, his penthouse, and his entire identity crashed down on him. He was not a hardened criminal. He was a spoiled, pampered boy who had always relied on his parents to clean up his messes. But Desmond was cowering in a chair and Valerie was sobbing on the floor. No one was going to save him. Jamal scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from the advancing federal agents to the heavy velvet curtains covering the service doors near the catering kitchen. It was the only exit that was not blocked by uniformed officers. Jamal bolted. He lunged forward, pushing past a terrified bridesmaid and sprinting frantically toward the back of the ballroom. His expensive leather shoes slipped wildly on the polished mahogany dance floor, but he managed to catch his balance, his arms pumping as he ran for his life. He looked completely absurd. A grown man in a torn, custom-tailored tuxedo fleeing across a sea of white orchids and crystal centerpieces. "Stop right there," one of the federal agents shouted, breaking into a run. Jamal did not stop. He blindly plowed into a catering waiter who was carrying a massive silver tray of champagne flutes. The collision was spectacular. The tray flew into the air, raining glass and expensive champagne across the tables and the fleeing groom. Jamal slipped on the wet floor, stumbling heavily, but he scrambled back up, his eyes fixated on the swinging service doors just 30 feet away. He was fast, but he was completely out of his league. Richard Sterling's private security detail had been anticipating a flight response. Before Jamal could even reach the edge of the carpet, the 2 massive men in dark suits who had escorted us from the bridal suite moved with terrifying coordinated speed. They cut across the perimeter of the room, intercepting Jamal's path with the precision of guided missiles. Jamal saw them at the last second. He tried to pivot, letting out a panicked, high-pitched yell, but it was useless. The lead security guard lunged forward, wrapping his massive arms around Jamal's waist and driving his shoulder squarely into Jamal's midsection. The tackle was brutal. Jamal was lifted completely off his feet, flying through the air before slamming violently onto the hard floor. The sickening sound of the impact echoed through the ballroom. The seam of his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo jacket ripped open with a loud tear, exposing the pristine white shirt underneath. Jamal gasped, all the air violently driven from his lungs, his arms flailing uselessly against the plush carpet. Before he could even attempt to crawl away, the second guard was on him, pressing a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades and pinning his arms behind his back. "Get off me!" Jamal shrieked, his voice muffled by the carpet. "Get off me!" "I did not do it. My mother told me to do it. It was her idea." He was still trying to use Valerie as a human shield, still crying for his mommy while being held down by private security. It was the ultimate display of his pathetic, cowardly nature. The uniformed police officers quickly jogged over, parting the crowd of stunned guests. The security guards smoothly stepped back, handing the suspect over to the proper authorities. A burly police officer hauled Jamal to his knees, grabbing his wrists and roughly pulling them together. The cold, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound in the room. "Jamal Washington," the federal agent said, stepping forward and looking down at my brother with absolute disdain. "You are under arrest for suspicion of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jamal was openly bawling now, his tears dripping onto his torn collar as the officer hauled him roughly to his feet. He looked completely destroyed, a shattered shell of the arrogant prince he had pretended to be just an hour ago. Across the room, Desmond watched his golden child being read his Miranda rights. The blood had entirely left Desmond's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mind was racing a mile a minute. He knew exactly what was coming next. If the federal agents began digging into Jamal's fraudulent corporate accounts, it was only a matter of time before they found the wire transfers I had exposed. They would see the hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled directly into Desmond's illegal gambling debts. They would see that the respected community leader was secretly financing a severe gambling addiction with stolen money. He was going to be implicated. He was going to lose his freedom. The walls were closing in, and Desmond's legendary survival instinct kicked into overdrive. He needed a distraction. He needed a medical emergency to delay the inevitable questioning. He needed a way out of that ballroom before the federal agents turned their attention to him. Desmond stood up from his chair. He looked wildly around the room, making sure he had the attention of the surrounding guests. Then, with the theatrical flair of a desperate cornered man, he violently grabbed the left side of his chest. His face contorted into a mask of exaggerated agony. He let out a loud, dramatic groan, his eyes rolling back in his head. He stumbled forward, knocking over a chair, and collapsed heavily onto the floor, his hands clutching his custom tuxedo shirt. "My heart!" Desmond wheezed loudly, gasping for air, and writhing on the carpet in a pathetic, transparent display of fabricated distress. "Oh God, my heart! I cannot breathe. Call an ambulance." A wave of genuine terrified panic finally broke through the crowd. Women in expensive silk gowns shrieked and scrambled backward, their high heels clicking frantically against the polished wood as they tried to put distance between themselves and the collapsing patriarch. Men shouted for someone to call 911. The sheer chaos Desmond managed to incite in a matter of seconds was a testament to his lifetime of manipulative theatrics. The federal agents and uniformed police officers momentarily froze their training, dictating that they must hold off on an arrest during an active, life-threatening medical emergency. They stepped back, giving the writhing man space, their faces tight with sudden concern. Desmond continued his spectacular performance. He rolled onto his side, his hands clawing at the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored tuxedo shirt, as if he were trying to rip it open to access his failing heart. He squeezed his eyes shut, his face contorted in a mask of absolute agony, letting out loud, ragged, wet gasps that echoed terribly through the grand ballroom. He looked exactly like a man who was moments away from slipping into cardiac arrest. He expected the room to stop. He expected the authorities to fall back. He expected me to rush to his side, weeping and terrified, begging the universe to spare my beloved father. I did not panic. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. With absolute clinical composure, I stepped forward. The panicked guests immediately parted for me, recognizing the calm authority radiating from my posture. I did not approach the thrashing man on the floor as a frightened daughter watching her father suffer. I approached him as a highly trained advanced practice nurse who had spent thousands of hours running trauma codes in high-pressure emergency departments. I had brought actual dying patients back from the brink of oblivion. I knew exactly what a myocardial infarction looked like. I knew the color of oxygen-deprived skin. I knew the specific terrifying rhythm of a failing cardiovascular system. And I knew Desmond Washington was faking it. I knelt gracefully beside him on the mahogany dance floor, the heavy emerald silk of my evening gown pooling around my knees. Desmond cracked one eye open, catching sight of me leaning over him. He immediately amplified his performance, letting out a choked, rattling cough and arching his back in simulated pain. I ignored his dramatics completely. I reached out my hands, moving with swift professional efficiency. I grabbed his right wrist, my fingers pressing firmly against his radial artery. Desmond tried to pull his arm away, keeping up the illusion of uncontrollable agony, but my grip was like a steel vise. I held his wrist steady, feeling the pulse hammering beneath his skin. It was fast, driven by the adrenaline of a cornered criminal facing a federal indictment, but it was incredibly strong. The rhythm was perfectly even. It was bounding with healthy, well-oxygenated blood. There was absolutely no sign of a thready, erratic, or failing pulse that would indicate sudden cardiac distress. I released his wrist and moved my hand to his forehead. Desmond flinched, still gasping loudly for air. A person experiencing a genuine massive heart attack goes into cardiogenic shock. Their body redirects blood flow to the vital organs, leaving the surface of the skin cold, clammy, and drenched in a terrible cold sweat known as diaphoresis. Desmond's skin was completely dry. He was warm to the touch. He possessed a healthy, flushed complexion that completely contradicted the narrative of a man whose heart was currently failing. Finally, I reached into the small beaded clutch I had carried all evening. I pulled out my smartphone and turned on the bright LED flashlight. With my free hand, I firmly grabbed Desmond's chin, holding his thrashing head completely still. I used my thumb to pull his right eyelid open and flashed the bright, piercing light directly into his pupil. Desmond let out a sharp yell of genuine surprise and annoyance, trying to jerk his head away from the blinding light. But I had already seen everything I needed to see. His pupil constricted immediately, reacting perfectly to the sudden introduction of intense light. They were equal, round, and beautifully responsive. There was no sluggishness. There were no neurological deficits. There was no lack of oxygen to his brain. He was perfectly, annoyingly healthy. I turned off my flashlight and dropped my phone back into my clutch. I took a deep, steadying breath, absorbing the absolute absurdity of the man lying on the floor in front of me. He had stolen my mother's money. He had treated me like a worthless servant. He had financed a fraudulent tech empire on the backs of his community. And now, facing the consequences of his own monumental greed, he was pretending to die on a dance floor just to avoid being put in handcuffs. I stood back up, rising to my full height. I smoothed the front of my silk gown with calm, deliberate strokes. The entire ballroom was completely silent, every single guest, federal agent, and police officer watching me, waiting for my expert medical assessment. I looked down at Desmond, who was still peering up at me through squinted eyes, waiting for me to validate his performance. I did not give him the satisfaction. I turned my head, looking directly at the lead federal agent and the uniformed police officers who were hovering anxiously nearby. "His heart rate is perfectly steady," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, terrified silence of the ballroom with sharp surgical precision. His skin is completely dry and his pupils are perfectly normal. He is not in cardiogenic shock. He is not experiencing a myocardial infarction. It is a fake panic attack. A ripple of absolute shock washed through the crowd. The politicians and socialites who had been gripping their pearls in terror suddenly dropped their hands, their expressions hardening into pure, unadulterated outrage. They had been manipulated. They had been played. And they realized it all at once. "Cuff him, officers," I commanded, pointing a single manicured finger down at the man writhing on the carpet. "He is an accessory to wire fraud, and he is perfectly healthy enough to take the ride downtown." Desmond stopped groaning instantly. The theatrical gasping ceased. The writhing came to an abrupt, humiliating halt. He lay completely still on the carpet, his eyes wide and fixed on my face in absolute horrified disbelief. The realization crashed down on him with devastating force. His final desperate illusion had failed. The ultimate escape route had been ruthlessly blocked by the daughter he had spent his entire life trying to erase. The federal agents did not hesitate. The moment I provided the medical clearance, their professional courtesy vanished. The two uniformed police officers stepped forward with grim determination. They reached down, grabbing Desmond by the shoulders of his immaculate custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. They did not help him up gently. They yanked him violently off the floor. Desmond let out a startled, undignified yelp as he was hauled to his feet. His polished, arrogant facade was completely destroyed. His expensive jacket was twisted and wrinkled, his silk tie hanging crookedly around his neck. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer barked, his voice leaving no room for argument or negotiation. Desmond tried to resist his pride, fighting a useless battle against reality. He stiffened his shoulders, looking frantically around the room at the hundreds of elite guests watching his downfall. "Do you know who I am?" Desmond sputtered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You cannot do this to me. I am Desmond Washington. I am a pillar of this community. I demand to speak to my lawyer immediately." No one cared. The officer simply grabbed Desmond's wrists, twisting them roughly behind his back with practiced, unyielding force. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Desmond's wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly over the ambient murmurs of the stunned crowd. They shoved him forward, forcing him to stand right next to his golden child son. The visual was breathtaking in its sheer poetic justice. The great Desmond Washington, the untouchable patriarch, the man who demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him, was standing in handcuffs next to his blubbering, ruined son. Jamal was still crying openly, his face shiny with tears and mucus, his torn tuxedo jacket hanging off his shoulders like rags. Desmond looked at Jamal, and then he looked out at the sea of wealthy, powerful people who had once respected him. The politicians he had lobbied, the business leaders he had dined with, the country club board members he had played golf with. They were all staring at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. He had been exposed as a fraud, a thief, and a coward. For the first time in his life, Desmond Washington began to cry. They were not the fake, theatrical tears he had used moments earlier. These were real hot tears of absolute crushing defeat. His shoulders shook as the reality of his future set in. He was going to a federal holding cell. He was going to lose his mansion, his cars, and his freedom. He was going to lose everything. "Let us go," the lead federal agent ordered, gesturing toward the main doors. The police officers grabbed the arms of the two men, marching them forward. The grand procession out of the ballroom was a walk of ultimate shame. Desmond and Jamal were paraded down the center aisle, their heads bowed, their expensive shoes dragging across the floor. The crowd of elite guests watched them go in absolute silence. No one offered a word of support. No one stepped forward to defend them. They were marched out of the spectacular, orchid-filled room and into the cold, harsh reality of the criminal justice system. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate. And then there was only Valerie. Valerie was left entirely alone in the very center of the massive dance floor. The men who had defined her entire existence, the husband who provided her wealth, and the son who provided her status, were gone. She was kneeling on the hardwood floor, her heavy beaded silk gown tangled around her legs, her flawless makeup ruined by streaks of black mascara and foundation. She looked like a discarded broken doll. She slowly pushed herself up, her hands shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. She stumbled to her feet, swaying unsteadily on her expensive heels. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. Her kingdom had collapsed. Her illusion of superiority had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She needed an anchor. She needed someone to validate her existence, someone to tell her that she still belonged in this glittering, wealthy world. She turned toward the tables closest to the dance floor. She spotted the president of her elite, exclusive sorority. The woman she had hosted lavish garden parties for, the woman she had spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to impress. Valerie stumbled toward her, reaching out a trembling, desperate hand. "Elaine." Valerie wept, her voice a shrill, cracking plea. "Elaine, please, you know me. You know we are good people. Please, you have to help me. You have to tell them this is a mistake." Elaine did not say a word. She simply picked up her crystal champagne flute, turned her shoulder, and looked pointedly in the opposite direction, completely ignoring Valerie's existence. Valerie gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. The rejection was brutal. She spun around, her wild eyes searching the room again. She spotted the head deacon of their prestigious megachurch, the man who had sat at their dinner table just last week. Deacon Marcus. Valerie cried out, practically throwing herself toward him. "Please, we have donated so much to the building fund. We are pillars of the congregation. Please help me. My family is being destroyed." The deacon looked at her with an expression of cold, righteous judgment. He slowly shook his head, took his wife's arm, and deliberately stepped away from the table, putting as much physical distance between himself and Valerie as possible. "Help me!" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted, gilded ceilings. She spun in a frantic circle, addressing the entire room of 300 elite guests. "Help me! Somebody please help me! We are the Washingtons. You all know us. You all love us. Please." But the crowd did not move to help her. Instead, as Valerie stumbled forward, reaching out with desperate, clawing hands, the wealthy politicians, the church deacons, the sorority sisters, and the corporate titans did exactly what society does when a fraud is finally exposed. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. They stepped back in unison, their silk gowns and tailored suits rustling softly in the quiet room. They pulled their chairs away. They averted their eyes. They turned their backs on her in absolute silent disgust. No one spoke. No one offered a comforting hand. Valerie Washington was left standing completely alone in a sea of luxury, screaming into a void that would never ever answer her again. The sheer suffocating isolation of that moment hung over the ballroom like a heavy, impenetrable shroud. Valerie Washington, a woman who had spent the last 30 years meticulously clawing her way up the social ladder, was suddenly untethered from the very world she worshipped. She stood trembling under the cascading light of the massive crystal chandeliers, her breath hitching in ragged, painful gasps. The silence of the elite crowd was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders and forcing her to acknowledge her complete and utter irrelevance. She looked left and right, her mascara-streaked eyes silently begging for a single friendly face, a single lifeline. There was absolutely nothing but cold, aristocratic disdain. From the edge of the polished mahogany dance floor, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the catering staff. It was Mr. Harrison, the senior venue manager of the luxury hotel. He was a man accustomed to catering to billionaires, diplomats, and international royalty. He moved with the stiff, unyielding posture of someone who had just been deeply insulted by the presence of a fraud in his immaculate establishment. He adjusted his tailored lapels, his expression completely devoid of the sycophantic warmth he usually reserved for paying clients. He marched directly toward Valerie, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He did not offer a polite bow. He did not use the deferential hushed tone she constantly demanded from service workers. He stopped a mere 2 feet away from her, radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. "Ma'am," Mr. Harrison stated, his voice carrying the crisp professional edge of an executioner. "I have just been informed by our accounting department that the groom's primary credit card, which was placed on file to cover the remaining balance of the venue fee, has been completely declined." Valerie blinked her mind, struggling to process this new, humiliating development. The concept of a declined card was a nightmare she had spent her entire marriage running from. She opened her mouth to argue, to demand he run it again, but Mr. Harrison did not give her the opportunity to speak. "Furthermore, we have been made aware by Mr. Sterling's security team that the initial deposit was secured through fraudulent means." He continued, his tone dropping to a level of icy, absolute finality. "Because you have no valid method of payment, and because the host of this event has explicitly canceled all proceedings, you no longer have any legal right to be in this building. You are currently trespassing. You need to leave the premises immediately." The word trespassing struck Valerie like a physical blow. It was a word reserved for criminals, for the unhoused, for people she actively looked down upon from the balcony of her elite country club. To be called a trespasser in a room full of her supposed peers was an indignity she could not fathom. She looked at Mr. Harrison, her jaw trembling, entirely unable to formulate a defense against the cold, hard facts of her absolute destitution. Panic, raw and absolute, finally overrode her shock. If she was being thrown out into the street, she needed to salvage something. Her frantic gaze darted toward the extravagant glass vanity table situated near the edge of the dance floor. Resting innocently on the reflective surface was her purse. It was a custom limited edition designer bag crafted from matty crocodile skin with pure palladium hardware. It was a status symbol worth more than most people made in an entire year, a tangible piece of the wealth she was desperately trying to hold on to. Valerie lunged for it. She scrambled across the floor, her heavy silk gown restricting her movements, her hands reaching out with desperate, clawing greed. If she could just get the bag, she could sell it. She could pawn it. She could use it to survive the coming storm. It was her final lifeline. She never reached the table. I stepped effortlessly into her path. My movements were fluid and completely relaxed, a stark contrast to her frantic, unhinged scrambling. Before her manicured fingers could even brush the soft, exotic leather of the designer bag, I brought my heel down hard. The sharp stiletto of my evening shoe pinned the thick leather strap of the purse firmly against the polished hardwood floor. Valerie slammed to a halt, her hands hovering mere inches from the bag. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sudden terrifying realization. The emerald silk of my gown brushed against her arm, but she shrank away as if my touch would burn her flesh. "That bag was bought with a credit card tied to my mother's stolen life insurance policy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the undeniable weight of a final judgment. "Leave it." The words hovered in the air, a final devastating revelation of her profound cruelty. This was not just about fraudulent corporate loans or bounced country club checks. This was about the systematic, parasitic draining of my biological mother's legacy. When my mother passed away, she had left a modest policy meant to ensure my education and survival. Desmond and Valerie had quietly drained it, funneling the cash into their lavish lifestyle, laundering the theft through a maze of hidden credit accounts to buy frivolous, ostentatious symbols of wealth, while I worked double shifts to pay for my nursing textbooks. "I know exactly how you paid for it, Valerie," I continued, leaning down slightly so my words would drill directly into her panicked brain. "I tracked every single transaction. I followed the wire transfers from the insurance payout directly to the designer boutique in Paris. You carried my mother's death on your arm, just so you could impress women who do not even like you." Valerie let out a small, strangled gasp. Her hands retreated, pulling back to her chest as if she had been burned. The sheer magnitude of her exposure left her entirely defenseless. She had no lies left to spin. She had no excuses left to fabricate. The elite crowd watching from the shadows murmured in fresh, disgusted shock. Stealing from a deceased woman's child to buy a handbag was a level of depravity that even the most cynical, hardened socialites found absolutely repulsive. "You do not own this," I commanded, radiating absolute authority. You do not own the house. You do not own the cars. You own absolutely nothing. Take your hands off my property." Valerie yanked her hands away, shrinking back onto the floor, utterly defeated. She had been stripped of her husband. She had been stripped of her golden child son. I had systematically dismantled her fake wealth, and now I was taking away her final piece of fabricated dignity. She was nothing but an empty, fraudulent shell. Mr. Harrison did not need any further prompting. He snapped his fingers twice. Two large, broad-shouldered men from the hotel's private security detail stepped forward, moving with silent, unyielding efficiency. They did not treat Valerie like a VIP guest. They treated her exactly like the trespasser she was. The first guard grabbed her firmly by the left arm, hauling her to her feet, with zero regard for the delicate, heavy beading of her expensive silk gown. Valerie let out a loud, pathetic wail, her legs buckling beneath her, but the second guard instantly grabbed her right arm, forcing her to stand upright. They held her in a vice grip, lifting her slightly off the floor, so she had no choice but to move forward. "No!" Valerie screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, ugly screech. "No, you cannot do this! I am a VIP! I am on the charity board! You cannot throw me out like a criminal!" She thrashed wildly, kicking her legs and twisting her shoulders, but her efforts were entirely useless against the seasoned security personnel. They began to march her away from the center of the ballroom, but they did not guide her toward the grand, sweeping mahogany doors at the front entrance. They did not afford her the dignity of leaving through the main lobby where the valet waited. Instead, they turned her sharply toward the rear of the ballroom. They dragged her directly toward the swinging metal reinforced doors of the service entrance, the exit reserved for taking out the trash and clearing the catering waste. The symbolism was absolute and devastating. Valerie Washington, a woman obsessed with grand entrances and high society visibility, was being forcibly removed through the garbage exit. She wept openly, her sobs echoing terribly off the vaulted gilded ceilings. Her carefully pinned hair collapsed into a messy, tangled halo around her streaked, tear-stained face. Her expensive heels dragged uselessly across the floor. As she was hauled past the tables of her former friends, not a single person reached out to her. The church deacons stared at the ceiling. The sorority sisters sipped their champagne, pretending she did not exist. The politicians engaged in sudden, quiet conversations with their neighbors. She was entirely erased from their world before she even made it to the door. The security guards pushed the heavy metal service doors open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the catering hallway spilled into the dim, romantic ambiance of the ballroom, cutting through the illusion of luxury. With one final hysterical wail, Valerie was shoved through the doorway. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, cutting off her screams with a solid metallic thud. She was gone. The silence that descended upon the grand ballroom was heavy, absolute, and profoundly peaceful. The toxic, suffocating presence of the Washington family had been completely eradicated. The air felt lighter, as if a massive, oppressive storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, clean calm. The remaining guests stood in stunned quiet, slowly processing the sheer magnitude of the reckoning they had just witnessed. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, my breathing steady, my posture perfectly relaxed. I looked down at the crocodile leather bag resting by my feet, feeling a quiet, deep sense of closure. My mother's legacy had been avenged. The parasites who had fed on my life and ambition were completely destroyed. I had won. As the chaos began to settle, a quiet, measured footstep approached me from the right. I turned my head to see Richard Sterling stepping out of the shadows. The billionaire patriarch had watched the entire execution with sharp, calculating eyes. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned everything he surveyed, completely unfazed by the dramatic collapse of his daughter's wedding. He stopped beside me. Without saying a word, he extended his impeccably manicured hand. Held delicately between his fingers was a tall crystal flute of vintage champagne. The bubbles rose in a rapid golden stream, catching the light of the overhead chandeliers. I looked at the glass, then up into his weathered, highly intelligent face. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed by the cancellation of the event. He looked profoundly impressed. I accepted the glass, my fingers brushing the cool crystal. Maya Richards said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded instant respect. He raised his own glass in a subtle, acknowledging toast. My company has been looking for a visionary healthcare CEO to back for a nationwide expansion. He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle between us. It was not just a job, it was the keys to an empire, the ultimate validation of the intellect and drive my family had spent a lifetime trying to suppress. I have interviewed dozens of executives, cutthroat businessmen, and Ivy League prodigies. Richard continued, his gaze steady. None of them possessed the clinical brilliance, the financial ruthlessness, and the absolute terrifying composure that I just watched you demonstrate. He took a slow sip of his champagne, a faint approving smile touching the corners of his mouth. I looked at the crystal flute suspended between Richard Sterling's fingers, then raised my gaze to meet his unwavering, predatory eyes. The offer he just made hung in the cool air of the ballroom, vibrating with the kind of monumental power that altered destinies. He was not making a polite gesture of gratitude. Men like Richard Sterling did not hand out corporate empires as thank you gifts. He was making a highly calculated investment. He had witnessed my ability to dismantle a deeply entrenched, fraudulent network under immense psychological pressure. He recognized a weapon when he saw one, and he wanted that weapon in his arsenal. I did not gasp. I did not feign humility. I reached out and took the glass from his hand, my grip firm and absolute. I met his stare with equal intensity. I do not want to be a figurehead, Richard. I stated, my voice ringing with cool professional authority. If I take the helm of a nationwide healthcare expansion, I demand total operational control. I will restructure the triage protocols, I will direct the acquisition of rural clinic networks, and I will personally oversee the auditing of every board member. I do not answer to committees. I answer to the bottom line and the survival rate of my patients. A slow, genuine smile spread across Richard's weathered face. He appreciated ruthlessness. You have the floor, Maya, he replied, raising his own glass in a silent pact, and you have my backing. Before I could take a sip, the heavy mahogany doors leading to the private bridal suite swung open. Chloe Sterling stepped back out onto the polished dance floor, but the fragile, devastated bride was completely gone. She had shed the massive, suffocating layers of her custom silk wedding gown. In its place, she wore a razor-sharp, tailored ivory pantsuit that fit her like armor. Her hair, previously styled in soft, romantic curls, was now pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She looked exactly like the corporate titan she was raised to be. Chloe walked over to join us, her posture radiating absolute invulnerability. She took her place beside her father, forming an impenetrable wall of sterling power. She looked at me, a sharp, validating gleam in her eyes. I see my father has already made his pitch, Chloe said, her voice crisp and commanding. I told him while we were waiting for the authorities that anyone who could systematically dismantle Desmond Washington's financial fortress with such surgical precision belonged on our board of directors. You saved me from binding my family to a parasite, Maya. The very least we can do is fund your vision. I raised my glass to her, acknowledging the unbreakable alliance that had just been forged in the fires of her ruined wedding. Richard turned his attention to the bewildered catering manager who was hovering nervously near the kitchen doors, unsure of what to do with the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of prepared food. The wedding is permanently canceled, Richard announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. However, the night is still young and the champagne is already paid for. Let us consider this an impromptu celebration of new ventures. Bring out the food. Resume the music. The musicians, eager to break the heavy tension, immediately struck up a smooth, upbeat jazz arrangement. The sudden influx of music acted as a release valve for the entire ballroom. Waiters in crisp white jackets flooded the floor, carrying massive silver trays of caviar, fresh oysters, and towering glasses of vintage champagne. The transition was breathtakingly seamless. Within 5 minutes, the sight of a brutal family execution had transformed into an exclusive high-stakes corporate mixer. The socialites, politicians, and business moguls who had actively avoided my gaze all evening suddenly swarmed me. The hypocrisy was thick enough to slice with a scalpel. The very people who had whispered behind their hands about my inexpensive dress. The people who had laughed at Desmond's cruel jokes regarding my nursing career now pushed their way through the crowd, desperate to hand me their embossed business cards. I stood at the center of the room, maintaining absolute icy control. I accepted their cards with polite non-committal nods, categorizing their sudden sycophancy for exactly what it was: pure survival. They recognized that the center of power had violently shifted. The Washington family was dead, and the Sterling family had just crowned a new queen. These people were scrambling to align themselves with the new apex predator in the room, Elaine, the president of Valerie's elite sorority. The woman who had literally turned her back on my sobbing mother moments earlier pushed her way to the front of the line. "Maya, darling." Elaine gushed, her face stretched into a painfully fake smile. "We always knew you were the bright one in that family. Your vision for healthcare is exactly what this city needs. I would love to invite you to speak at our next charity gala." I looked at her, my expression completely flat. "I do not have time for charity galas, Elaine," I replied, my voice cutting through her artificial warmth like a blade. "My schedule is dedicated to restructuring hospitals, not sipping tea with women who abandon their friends the second their credit cards bounce." Elaine gasped, her face flushing a deep, mottled red, and she quickly retreated into the crowd. I did not stop there. I navigated their transparent desperation with the same clinical detachment I used when triaging a crowded emergency room. I shut down arrogant investors. I dismantled flawed business pitches in 3 sentences. I dominated the space surrounded by the very people who had ignored me hours ago, but who were now practically begging for my mentorship and financial backing. As I deflected a particularly aggressive pitch from a local pharmaceutical representative, a sudden stir near the main entrance of the ballroom caught my attention. The heavy double doors parted and a man walked into the room who looked entirely out of place among the silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Yet he commanded the space with a quiet, undeniable gravity. It was David. My fiancé was a trauma surgeon. He had come straight from a grueling 12-hour shift at the county hospital's Level 1 trauma center. He was still wearing his dark navy scrubs, his hospital ID badge clipped securely to his collar, a lightweight gray jacket thrown haphazardly over his broad shoulders. He looked physically exhausted, his dark hair slightly rumpled from wearing a surgical cap, but his eyes swept the room with the sharp, assessing gaze of a man accustomed to walking into chaotic, high-stakes environments and immediately taking control. He was the absolute antithesis of Jamal. Jamal needed flashy, customized clothes, leased luxury cars, and stolen money to feel important. David wore simple cotton scrubs and owned the entire room through sheer, unadulterated competence and character. He dealt with real life and death every single day, making Desmond's fake heart attack look even more pathetic in hindsight. David spotted me instantly through the crowd of fawning executives. The exhaustion melted from his face, replaced by a warm, grounding smile that anchored me completely. The surrounding crowd of socialites parted for him, sensing the unspoken authority radiating from his presence. David did not care about the billionaires or the politicians staring at his work clothes. He walked straight up to me, pulling me into a firm, profoundly reassuring embrace. He smelled like sterile hospital soap and the crisp, clean night air. He kissed the top of my forehead, his heavy hand resting securely on the small of my back. He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, a knowing, deeply affectionate gleam in his expression. He glanced around the massive, opulent ballroom, taking in the remnants of the shattered Washington Empire, the federal agents finishing their paperwork near the service doors, the fawning corporate executives, and Chloe Sterling holding court by the bar with her father. David looked back at me, a wry, brilliant smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I heard you did some aggressive cleaning tonight," David said, his voice a low, steady rumble that only I could hear. I looked up at the man who had supported me through every double shift, every moment of self-doubt, and every cruel insult my family had ever hurled my way. He had never demanded I change. He had simply waited for me to realize my own power. "Just taking out the trash," I replied, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking through my composed, icy facade. "Come on, let's toast to the future." I reached out, lacing my fingers securely through his. We turned toward the center of the room, raising our crystal glasses toward the bright cascading lights of the chandeliers. The sound of our glasses meeting rang out clear and sharp, a perfect chiming note that signaled the absolute end of the past and the brilliant beginning of everything else.